Imagine standing in a dimly lit barn, the air heavy with the smell of hay, mud, and animals. A cow is being milked not into a shiny stainless steel container, not even into something vaguely clean, but into a wooden bucket that has seen better days. The same bucket might have been used earlier to carry water for washing tools, or even to collect scraps for pigs. The farmer's hands, calloused and stained, have not touched soap in hours, maybe days. And yet, what drips from the animal's udder is considered precious, almost sacred. Fresh milk. The irony is hard to ignore. What was believed to be a symbol of purity often carried more invisible threats than a cup of river water. The people drinking it never questioned whether the problem might come not from the cow itself, but from the complete lack of hygiene surrounding the process. Hey, have you subscribed yet, or are you waiting for the milk to go sour first? Hit that button and tell me. What time is it where you are right now? Morning coffee or midnight snack vibes? Hygiene, as we understand it today, was not even part of the equation. The idea of microscopic organisms was still distant from common knowledge, so when farmers wiped their hands on their trousers before grabbing the udder, it was simply routine. Dirt under the fingernails was a sign of honest work, not a sign of bacteria waiting to cause illness. Imagine someone today scooping yogurt into a bowl with a hand that had just fixed a muddy cartwheel. No one would accept it. But back then, people did not just accept it, they trusted it. And this trust became one of the deadliest blind spots in daily life. The buckets themselves were silent conspirators. Made of porous wood, they trapped old milk deep inside their fibers. Even if rinsed with cold water, they remained damp, a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Families passed these buckets down through generations as if they were heirlooms, never realizing they were passing along colonies of disease. If the milk smelled off, some would simply stir it or add sweeteners to cover the sourness, turning what was already spoiled into something even more dangerous. It's a little like finding leftovers in the fridge that smell strange, pouring on extra ketchup, and calling it dinner, except this dinner could easily lead to fever, diarrhea, or death. In cities, where milk traveled longer distances before reaching the table, the conditions grew even worse. Carried in open containers through dusty streets, every gust of wind sprinkled dirt into the liquid. Horses pulling carts often splashed manure into the buckets, and yet mothers still poured that milk into their children's cups. There's something haunting about imagining a child's first sip in the morning carrying not just nutrients, but the bacteria of 100 dirty hands, flies, and animal waste. The innocence of the scene, milk for breakfast, collides violently with the hidden truth. The tragedy is that no one saw milk as suspicious. Water, yes, people distrusted. Rivers were visibly dirty. Wells often tasted strange, and whole communities knew the dangers of unsafe water. But milk had this aura of purity. It came from nature, from animals that people often considered part of the family. The cow gave, and people accepted. To question the cleanliness of milk felt almost like questioning a mother's love. That blind faith made milk even more insidious, because the danger was not where people expected it. Sometimes, the things we trust the most are the ones that harm us most deeply. One of the cruel ironies is that milk was often fed to the weakest members of society. Children, the sick, the elderly. They needed strength, and milk was thought to provide it. Yet these same people were the least capable of resisting infection. Families would save the freshest portions for their babies, believing they were offering the purest gift of nourishment, while in reality they were handing over liquid laced with invisible killers. This is where history strikes with a kind of dark comedy. The drink that symbolized health was, in truth, a frequent cause of death. Imagine proudly pouring a glass of something you believe will heal, only to discover later it carried the seed of illness. That is not just tragedy, it is irony, sharpened by ignorance. And yet, even in the middle of this risk, people found ways to make it worse. If the supply of milk wasn't enough, some sellers mixed in water to stretch it further, not clean, boiled water, but water from streams, cisterns, or even canals. The milk was already vulnerable, but this practice guaranteed contamination. And still, customers lined up. After all, milk was expensive, and everyone wanted a share of it. Nobody thought twice about where that extra liquid came from. The same people who wouldn't dare drink river water by itself would happily consume it disguised in milk. It is as if fear could be fooled by color. White was reassuring, so people trusted it. This false sense of safety created a paradox. Families might boil their drinking water, but never thought to boil their milk. To them, boiling ruined the taste, took away its natural strength. Heinz. So milk often went from cow to bucket, bucket to jug, jug to mouth without ever meeting heat. When illness followed, people blamed the weather, the gods, or even their own weak constitutions. Rarely did anyone suspect the culprit was the very thing they believed gave them life. The result was an unspoken daily lottery. Each glass could be nourishing or it could be lethal, and no one knew until the consequences appeared. If someone fell sick after drinking, they would dismiss it as coincidence. After all, the milk looked pure, smelled sweet, and came from a familiar cow. That misplaced trust became its own kind of superstition, where purity was imagined instead of proven. And the strange part is that it worked just enough times to keep the illusion alive. Most people survived their milk, until they didn't. We look back now and shake our heads at the negligence, but the truth is more uncomfortable. We too accept risks every day without thinking. We laugh at the image of someone wiping their hands on dirty trousers before milking, yet how many of us eat food dropped on the floor under the 5-second rule? How often do we drink from a glass we only half rinsed? The difference is that we live with refrigerators, pasteurization, and modern medicine as safety nets. They had nothing but faith and tradition can be a dangerous disinfectant when it replaces real hygiene. Every drop of milk carried a story, a gamble between nourishment and poison. And while families gathered around their tables, drinking with smiles and good intentions, the reality remained that each glass was a silent risk. It is in this tension, between innocence and danger, purity and contamination, that milk became not just a drink, but a mirror of human ignorance. And once you recognize that, you start to see how fragile trust can be when it rests on illusions. If the first danger was the careless act of milking with dirty hands, the second horror began. Once the milk left the cow and met the world of tools and containers that carried it to people's homes. Imagine the everyday bucket, not the gleaming stainless steel we expect today, but rough, heavy wood bound by iron hoops. These buckets had pores and cracks that swallowed every drop of old milk that seeped inside. Even when washed, the sourness never truly left. They smelled faintly rancid, a smell so familiar to people of the past that they mistook it for normal. What they didn't know was that these hidden corners were breeding grounds, miniature laboratories, where invisible enemies multiplied, waiting for their chance to be swallowed. The tools themselves told the same story. Ladles carved from wood, jugs passed from one family to another, even cloths used for straining the milk. All of them were traps for bacteria. It's almost comic to think of it now. People sincerely believed they were purifying milk by straining it through cloth, when in reality they were rubbing it against fabric that had dried in the sun covered with dust, soot, or insect remains. That purification was more of a performance, a gesture to feel safer, rather than something that truly worked. Sometimes what humans do to feel clean is the very thing that seals their fate. Consider for a moment how milk was transported into towns. Instead of sealed bottles, it traveled in open containers, sloshing back and forth as carts hit bumps along the road. Each bump sent drops flying, which quickly attracted flies. Some of those flies ended up drowning in the milk, while others simply carried filth from manure piles straight into the bucket. Picture a housewife in 1800s London pouring that same milk into her child's porridge without hesitation. It looked white, it smelled sweet enough, so it had to be fine. The thought that a dead fly had dissolved in that jug never even crossed her mind. Ignorance wasn't bliss. It was a gamble with stakes measured in human lives. But there is another layer here that makes the story almost darkly humorous. While families worried constantly about the safety of water, boiling it, filtering it through sand, or even avoiding it entirely, the milk in their kitchens was treated like a trusted friend. No suspicion, no questions asked. If water was the shady neighbor you kept at a distance, milk was the warm-hearted friend invited inside, even if that friend tracked mud across the carpet. And so milk became a perfect disguise, a Trojan horse of health, carrying armies of unseen microbes into households. Think about the contradictions. Milk was praised as the drink of children, the food of the weak and sick, the closest substitute for mother's nourishment, yet the same milk might be ladled out of a container resting beside meat carcasses at a crowded market, swarmed by flies. It's like offering a sick patient a medicine pill you've just dropped into the gutter. The good intention doesn't erase the contamination. And still, the ritual continued every day, unbroken, because milk was too precious to abandon. What made this worse was the economy of survival. Buckets and tools were expensive. Families used them for years, sometimes decades, patching them when they cracked, never throwing them away. In a strange way, every scratch on the surface was part of the family's history, but also a hidden cave for bacteria. A bucket that had served a grandmother was proudly used for the grandchildren, even if it carried the invisible ghosts of illnesses that had struck the household long before. Objects don't forget, especially when they absorb what they carry. And in the case of milk containers, the memory was toxic. When you add to this the daily reality of households without soap as we know it today, the picture becomes clearer. Washing meant splashing with water, maybe scrubbing with sand or ash. To them, that was enough. To us, it seems almost laughable. But that laughter quickly fades when you realize that people genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They didn't see negligence, they saw routine. And that routine was what killed. One of the most chilling aspects of this reality is how ordinary it all felt. To the people of the past, a sour-smelling jug was just part of life. They had grown accustomed to the tang of half-fermented milk and didn't see it as a warning. In fact, some even preferred it, believing the taste meant the milk was stronger. It's a reminder of how human perception adapts, sometimes against survival itself. When danger is everywhere, people normalize it, and once it feels normal, they stop protecting themselves from it. The result was a chain of silent risks, passed from hand to hand, bucket to jug, jug to cup. Each step added new opportunities for contamination, but because it was hidden from sight, no one resisted. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson. What we don't see often harms us more than what we do. The families of the past didn't need monsters in the dark. They had microbes in their milk, multiplying in buckets that looked innocent. And once you realize this, it becomes impossible not to wonder how many lives were cut short not by famine or war, but by the quiet, everyday act of pouring a drink that seemed pure. Imagine sitting at a wooden table in the late 1800s. Your family gathered around you, and the only thing on the menu for the children is a steaming bowl of porridge softened with milk. The milk looks fresh, thick, and inviting. But hidden within it is something no one could see, something even doctors barely understood at the time, disease carried directly from the animals themselves. This was the silent betrayal of trust. The cow in the barn could appear strong, still giving milk each morning, and yet be harboring an illness capable of destroying entire households. Families didn't just drink milk, they drank whatever sickness the animal was carrying. Tuberculosis was the deadliest of these hidden passengers. Today, we understand that tuberculosis bacteria could live in the milk of infected cows and pass directly into the human body. But back then, there was no connection in people's minds between the coughing cow in the stall and the coughing child in the cradle. Whole communities were devastated without realizing that every glass of milk was fueling the epidemic. What makes this fact so haunting is that children were always the first victims. Their immune systems were weaker, their diets depended heavily on milk, and their parents unknowingly placed the poison in their hands each morning. It was not malice, it was ignorance, and ignorance kills just as effectively as cruelty. Then there was brucellosis, a disease that brought waves of fever, exhaustion, and long-term debilitation. Farmers often dismissed sick animals as simply off their feed, never suspecting that the milk they continued to provide was carrying a slow-burning infection into their own families. Brucellosis was sometimes called undulant fever because its symptoms came and went like tides. One week the victim would seem better, the next they would collapse again. Can you imagine the frustration of a 19th century family watching a loved one weaken, unable to connect the dots back to the cow that seemed so healthy just days before? Milk had become a bridge, carrying sickness from animal to human in the most intimate way possible. The terrifying part is that these diseases did not just strike at random, they struck with precision against those most dependent on milk. Babies who had been weaned, the elderly clinging to nourishment, and the sick whose recovery was thought to depend on milk's supposed healing properties. It is almost comedic in a dark way. The very groups being protected with milk were the exact ones most likely to be destroyed by it. It's like prescribing a medicine that guarantees the illness will deepen. And yet, with every spoonful and every sip, people felt reassured that they were doing good. Animals themselves told silent stories of suffering, but no one listened. A cow with lesions on its lungs, an udder swollen and painful, a coat losing its shine. These were shrugged off as normal. Farmers had to work with what they had. The luxury of discarding an animal was rare. Every drop of milk meant money, meant survival. To throw it away would have felt like wasting life itself. And so, day after day, milk from sick animals was carried to market, and day after day, families swallowed disease dressed in white. There's something sobering in realizing how closely tied human fate was to the health of animals. In an age before veterinary science, a farmer's guesswork decided whether a community lived or suffered. If a cow could stand and walk, it was deemed fit. If it gave milk, it was deemed healthy enough. But nature does not care about appearances. Inside those animals were bacteria with no mercy, and once released into milk, they found a direct highway into the human bloodstream. This is where the story becomes more tragic, because the diseases milk carried did not just cause illness, they shaped entire family histories. Records from the 19th century are filled with mothers who buried multiple children before the age of 5. Their deaths often attributed vaguely to fever or consumption. Imagine the psychological toll of believing fate or divine punishment had taken your children, while the true cause sat in a jug on your kitchen table. It was not sin nor fate. It was milk, that trusted companion, slowly betraying those who depended on it most. And yet, even as evidence of sickness mounted, people clung to the belief in milk's goodness. Doctors eventually began noticing patterns, but the public resisted. To them, the cow was a provider, almost sacred. How could something so natural be harmful? It's the same way we laugh today when someone claims natural always means safe. Hemlock is natural, arsenic is natural, but that doesn't make them safe. The milk of the 19th century was a similar paradox. Its natural state was often lethal, but people clung to the myth because the alternative was too frightening to accept. Every sip carried a gamble, a silent roll of the dice between nourishment and infection. Families leaned toward trust because to do otherwise would have meant questioning the very foundation of their survival. And so the jug of milk on the table remained, poured generously into bowls, even as children weakened, even as elders coughed blood, even as neighbors buried their loved ones. Milk was not just food, it was faith, and faith blinded them to the truth until it was far too late. Picture the scene. It is early morning in a bustling town, and the milkman rattles down cobblestone streets with metal containers slung over his cart. But these are not chilled, sealed, or even particularly clean. They are heavy cans left in the open air, often standing in the sun for hours before reaching a doorstep. Milk, unlike wine or beer, spoils almost immediately without cooling, and yet for centuries no one had access to refrigeration. What arrived at the table in the late afternoon was often a liquid already transforming into something else entirely, carrying smells and textures that should have raised alarm. But people had little choice. They drank what they had. Without refrigeration, milk became a ticking clock. In warm weather, it could sour in just a few hours. Families who purchased milk in the morning sometimes found it undrinkable by evening, and rather than discard it, they used it in cooking or masked the sourness with sugar or spices. There is a strange comedy in imagining someone proudly serving a pudding made from milk that was halfway to cheese, presenting it as a treat while unknowingly serving their guests a bacterial feast. Spoiled milk was not only consumed, it was celebrated as thrifty use. Waste was a luxury no family could afford, and so danger was disguised as resourcefulness. The problem stretched beyond the home. Markets sold milk in bulk, drawn from massive communal containers. Shoppers brought their own jugs, dipped them in, and walked away, often in the heat of the day. Every hand that touched the ladle added contamination. Every pause in the sun added fermentation. And yet, the belief in milk's wholesomeness endured. The irony is sharp. The more milk was celebrated as pure, the less effort was made to protect it from the very elements that corrupted it. Subscribe now. Unlike milk, that button never expires. And while you're at it, drop a comment. What time is it where you're watching from? Let's see how global this milk squad really is. There is also the psychological layer of trust. A family who paid hard-earned money for milk was not going to throw it away at the first hint of sourness. They convinced themselves it was fine, telling each other stories of how sour milk was good for digestion or strengthened the stomach. It is a familiar human instinct to justify what we cannot change. Just as people today invent excuses for questionable leftovers in the fridge, people in the past invented reasons why spoiled milk was secretly healthy. The tragedy is that these comforting lies often came at the cost of real suffering. Think of the children again, who were fed milk that tasted different each day depending on how long it had sat out. Some days it was creamy and rich, other days thin and sour. Their bodies became battlegrounds for invisible organisms that multiplied rapidly in warm conditions. Summer was the most dangerous season, when heat transformed every pail of milk into a breeding ground. Diaries from the time often mention summer complaint, a polite term for the diarrhea and dehydration that struck children during hot months. Few realized that this seasonal wave of illness was linked directly to milk spoiling faster in the heat. In cities growing rapidly with industrialization, the problem multiplied. Milk had to travel farther, often hours from farm to market. Without refrigeration, each hour was a risk. By the time it reached families, especially the poor, who could only afford cheaper batches, the milk was often well past its safe window. Yet, instead of discarding it, sellers stretched its life by adding chalk to whiten it, or even baking soda to mask the sourness. It was not just spoiled, it was spoiled and doctored, a cocktail of deception poured into the mouths of unsuspecting families. The absence of cooling technology created a cruel paradox. Milk was considered essential, but the very climate in which it was consumed turned it into poison. People accepted sourness as normal, just as they accepted the high child mortality around them as fate. They could not connect the two because the concept of refrigeration, of controlling temperature to preserve food, was still decades away. The first iceboxes and later mechanical refrigerators were marvels not only of comfort, but of survival, quietly ending the silent epidemics caused by spoiled milk. Looking back, it feels absurd that entire populations gambled their health on milk left standing in the sun, and yet in their world there was no alternative. They did not see themselves as careless. They saw themselves as practical, resilient, doing the best they could. The danger was invisible, the sourness familiar, and the milk, despite everything, remained on the table. That is the unsettling truth. Sometimes what feels normal is exactly what kills us. And when we see how spoiled milk shaped history, we begin to realize how fragile survival really was. Imagine a city milk vendor in the 19th century. He has only one problem. Demand is rising, but supply is limited. Cows can only produce so much, and customers want more than he can provide. The solution he finds is as simple as it is deadly. Stretch the milk with water. At first glance, it sounds harmless. After all, it's just water. But the water available in most towns and cities was far from pure. Wells were often contaminated by sewage, streams carried industrial waste, and cisterns collected rain mixed with soot from chimneys. When that water was poured into milk, the drink transformed from risky to downright dangerous. There is an unsettling irony here. Families who would never dare to drink water from the river, knowing it caused diarrhea and fever, would happily consume that same water hidden inside their milk. The milk's whiteness disguised the truth. Once diluted, it still looked pure, it still smelled sweet, and it even lasted longer. It was deception in the most elegant form, poison dressed in the clothing of innocence. Vendors knew exactly what they were doing. Every extra jug sold meant more profit, more customers, more survival in a cutthroat economy. For many, it was not seen as cruelty but necessity. They reasoned that the milk was still milk enough, and customers couldn't tell the difference. In fact, if anyone complained about the thin taste, vendors would smile and say, "That's the freshest batch. You can tell by how light it is." It is a reminder that lies don't need to be complicated to work. They just need to match what people want to believe. Sometimes the water wasn't the only addition. To restore the milk's white color after dilution, chalk was mixed in. To hide sourness, a pinch of baking soda. Some even used plaster powder. These tricks were passed quietly from vendor to vendor, each one more inventive than the last. A mother spooning milk into her baby's mouth might unknowingly be feeding them chalk and contaminated river water, thinking she was offering strength and nourishment. It is almost comical in its cruelty, if it weren't so tragic, and the tragedy was widespread. Newspapers of the 19th century began reporting on what they called swill milk scandals, exposing vendors who sold mixtures that had very little actual milk. In New York, investigations revealed that thousands of children had died because the milk they drank had been stretched, altered, and poisoned by these practices. The reports shocked the public, but also revealed just how much people had trusted what seemed pure. The very phrase milk scandal shows how betrayal felt. It wasn't just bad food, it was broken trust on a massive scale. What makes this even more chilling is how accepted it became. For many city dwellers, watered milk was simply normal, and they assumed milk was always thin, that it was always a little bland. Generations of families grew up never knowing what pure milk actually tasted like, and in that acceptance lay the danger. When people normalize corruption, they stop fighting against it. The practice of watering down milk is perhaps the clearest example of how survival and greed can blur the line between necessity and betrayal. The vendors claimed they were simply giving more families access to milk. In reality, they were feeding sickness to the most vulnerable. It forces us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we accept something harmful simply because it looks safe, simply because it has always been that way? And yet, as bad as watered milk was, there were other tricks and shortcuts lurking in the background, waiting to be uncovered. Because once survival and profit are at stake, the question is not just what people will add, but how far they are willing to go to keep milk flowing into cups. Imagine waking up in the 1800s, going about your morning with nothing more than bread and milk for breakfast. The milk looks perfectly fine, smooth, white, and reassuring. By noon, you begin to feel a strange discomfort in your stomach. By evening, you're sweating, your body shaking with fever, and the once harmless glass of milk has turned into a death sentence. The speed with which milk could deliver illness was terrifying. Unlike slow-building diseases that took weeks to reveal themselves, contaminated milk often worked its havoc in a matter of hours. People could drink in the morning and be bedridden by nightfall. This immediacy gave milk an almost sinister quality. Food poisoning from spoiled meat or tainted bread could also sicken people, but milk was unique in how directly and quickly it carried disease into the body. Because it was liquid, because it was consumed without cooking, the bacteria moved like lightning through the digestive system. One cup could carry millions of invisible organisms, each one multiplying the moment they entered the warmth of a human body. The result was not subtle: vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, fever, all within the same day. Families who trusted milk as a gentle, healing drink found themselves suddenly trapped in the chaos of sickness. There is something deeply tragic about the role of children in this story. Parents, believing milk to be the safest and most nourishing food, gave it most generously to their youngest. Babies too weak to breastfeed, toddlers just learning to walk, sick children needing strength, all were given cup after cup. And yet, they were the very ones least capable of surviving the sudden storm of infection. Diaries and parish records of the 19th century reveal shocking numbers of children dying of summer complaint, a polite phrase used to describe diarrhea and dehydration that often followed spoiled milk. Families might never know that the glass of milk they lovingly handed their child that morning was the exact thing that took them away by night. The speed of the sickness created confusion in communities. When whole neighborhoods were struck, rumors spread of curses, poisoned wells, or angry gods. Rarely did suspicion fall on milk because it looked too clean, too innocent. How could something so pure be responsible for so much misery? And yet, again and again, outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, or simple food poisoning were traced back to milk that had spoiled or been contaminated in transport. The milk itself became a kind of silent assassin, hiding behind its white mask until it revealed its true face in fever and death. Think of the psychological impact of this. To eat bread and cheese and fall ill days later was one thing. To drink milk and collapse by sunset was another. It planted a seed of fear that many tried to suppress. Some families began to boil their milk despite believing it ruined the taste. Others clung to superstition, adding herbs or even alcohol to the milk to strengthen it. But none of these were true solutions. The real enemy was unseen, and without knowledge of bacteria, people were fighting shadows with rituals. What makes this even more haunting is how routine it was. Falling sick after drinking milk was not rare, it was expected. Mothers would warn children, don't drink too much at once, not realizing the danger wasn't the quantity but the contamination. Families learned to live with cycles of sudden illness, accepting them as part of life's rhythm. What they didn't see was that they were normalizing poison, turning preventable tragedy into background noise. There's also a layer of dark comedy here, if one dares to see it. Imagine a family gathering, all drinking from the same jug in the morning, laughing, planning the day. By nightfall, the same family is lined up with buckets beside their beds, too sick to move. It almost reads like a grotesque play, where milk is both the opening act and the villain. The very thing shared in joy at the table becomes the reason everyone groans in misery hours later. Humanity has a way of turning blind faith into spectacle, and milk in the pre-refrigeration era was the perfect stage. In urban centers, this pattern became especially devastating. Factories and tenements packed families into tight spaces where sickness spread quickly. If one person became ill from contaminated milk, others in the household were almost guaranteed to follow, and soon entire blocks were struck. Physicians began to notice the pattern, but lacked the tools to explain it. Some suspected bad air, others believed it was divine punishment for urban sin. Few pointed to the milk jug sitting innocently in the kitchen. It's hard not to wonder how many lives might have been saved if suspicion had landed sooner on that everyday drink. And yet, the irony is that this cycle of sudden illness did lead to change, though slowly. As more people experienced the shock of drinking milk in the morning and suffering by night, pressure mounted for answers. Journalists began investigating, exposing filthy dairies and corrupt milk sellers. Reformers called for cleaner practices, and eventually scientists like Louis Pasteur proved that boiling milk killed the invisible killers inside. Pasteurization was born not from abstract curiosity, but from generations of families who had learned the hard way that milk could sicken faster than almost any other food. Still, before that turning point, the terror of same-day illness lingered like a shadow over every cup. To drink milk was to gamble, and the game was rigged against the weakest, the poor, the young, the frail. And that is perhaps the most unsettling truth. People continued to drink, not because they trusted milk, but because they had no choice. It was part of life, even when life itself was the price. This is where the story deepens. If milk could betray so quickly, it also raised a darker question. What else, beyond water and milk, was silently poisoning society in plain sight? Once you realize how easy it was for a glass of milk to bring suffering within hours, you begin to question everything that seemed ordinary on the table, and that suspicion, once awakened, was impossible to silence. Picture a world without refrigerators, where milk was never something that could be safely tucked away behind a cool glass door, waiting for the next meal. Instead, milk existed in a race against time, a fragile liquid that began to change the moment it left the cow. In the countryside, it was carried in pails across fields warmed by the sun. In the city, it was ladled out of heavy cans that sat for hours in the heat of crowded markets. Everyone knew milk spoiled quickly, but without refrigeration, there was no way to stop it. The only tools were speed, luck, and sometimes superstition. The chemistry of milk made it especially vulnerable. Rich in sugars, proteins, and fats, it was the perfect playground for bacteria. Left in even mild warmth, microbes multiplied by the millions, souring the liquid within hours. Farmers sometimes plunged containers into wells or streams to keep them cool, but that cooling was inconsistent at best, and often added contamination from the water itself. Ice was a luxury, carved in winter and stored in insulated houses, but most families never had access to it. So every jug of milk was essentially a gamble with the clock. Fresh in the morning, questionable by noon, and dangerous by night. Imagine a mother preparing breakfast in July. She pours milk into her children's porridge, noticing a faint sourness. Instead of discarding it, she shrugs and adds sugar, hoping to mask the flavor. Waste was not an option, especially for poor families. Later that day, when the children begin to complain of stomach pains, the connection between spoiled milk and sickness rarely crossed anyone's mind. Illness was explained by the weather, bad luck, or a weak stomach. The milk itself escaped blame, even as it spoiled faster than any other food in the household. Urban growth only magnified the problem. As cities expanded, milk had to travel farther from farms to reach consumers. By the time it rattled into town in a metal can, it had often spent half a day under the sun. Vendors would set their carts on busy corners, the milk sloshing back and forth, exposed to dust, flies, and heat. Customers brought their own jugs, dipped them into the communal container, and carried home what they hoped was still safe. But with every passing hour, the milk transformed. In the summer, its shelf life could be measured not in days, but in hours. Some buyers didn't even make it home before the milk began to sour. To stretch its lifespan, vendors relied on tricks. A sprinkle of baking soda to neutralize acidity, a dash of chalk to restore whiteness, even formaldehyde in some notorious cases to keep it from curdling. These chemicals did nothing to make the milk safer. They simply masked the signs of spoilage long enough to sell another batch. It was the illusion of freshness, and for families desperate for nourishment, illusions were often enough. The real cost came later, when sickness spread through households that had no idea they'd been deceived. Smash that like and subscribe before I show up at your door with a glass of warm milk to convince you. Oh, and tell me, what time is it for you? I bet someone's watching this at 3 a.m. It's easy to laugh now at the thought of people drinking milk that had been sitting in the sun for half a day. But the truth is sobering. They had no frame of reference, no concept of refrigeration as we know it. To them, sour milk wasn't always a warning sign. It was just part of daily life. Recipes for clabber and sour milk puddings were common, not as gourmet experiments, but as survival strategies. You didn't throw away milk that had turned. You found a way to eat it, disguising the spoilage with spices, baking, or sheer willpower. Food safety wasn't a standard. It was a compromise. The arrival of refrigeration would eventually transform this reality, but at the time it was science fiction. Ice boxes existed in wealthier homes, lined with blocks of ice delivered by horse-drawn wagons, but even these could not guarantee safety. Ice melted quickly in the summer, and poorer families had no way of storing it. By the late 19th century, only the very rich could enjoy consistently cool milk, and even then, the supply chain from cow to kitchen was riddled with opportunities for contamination. Refrigeration didn't just save milk, it saved lives. But until it spread, people were forced to live with the cruel reality that their most trusted food turned deadly faster than they could consume it. The lack of refrigeration also shaped culture in subtle ways. In many places, milk was not drunk in large quantities because people simply could not trust it to last. Beer, wine, and fermented drinks were safer because alcohol and fermentation slowed the growth of bacteria. Milk, on the other hand, required courage or desperation, and so, paradoxically, adults often avoided drinking fresh milk, while children were given it most frequently, exposing the most vulnerable to the greatest danger. This quiet inversion of logic, the weakest receiving the riskiest, was one of the defining tragedies of pre-refrigeration milk. Think about how profoundly different life was under these conditions. Today, we take for granted that a carton of milk will last a week in the fridge, that expiration dates are trustworthy, that cold chains protect us from invisible threats. But in the 19th century, no such assurances existed. Milk was alive, unstable, and fleeting. To consume it was to accept risk, and to sell it was to participate in a fragile illusion of safety. The fact that entire societies built their diets and traditions around such a volatile liquid shows how deeply humans will cling to necessity, even when necessity carries danger. And yet, this fragility pushed society toward innovation. The very dangers of spoiled milk forced scientists, doctors, and reformers to seek solutions, laying the groundwork for pasteurization and refrigeration systems that would change the world. But before those revolutions, milk remained a daily trial, a liquid that could nourish or destroy depending on nothing more than the passing of a few hours. And that relentless ticking clock made milk not just a drink, but a constant reminder of how thin the line was between survival and disaster. Imagine the daily life of a 19th century city. The streets are crowded, noisy, and filthy. Horses pull carts loaded with goods, their hooves clattering on the cobblestones, while they leave behind manure that steams in the sun. Children run barefoot, dogs scavenge scraps, and clouds of dust rise with every passing wheel. Now picture a milk vendor pushing his cart through this chaos, carrying open buckets of milk that sway with each bump in the road. Every splash is exposed to the air, to the dust, to the flies, and yet, when he arrives at a customer's home, the liquid is still poured with a smile as if it had remained untouched by the journey. The contradiction is staggering. People demanded purity, but accepted milk that had been paraded through some of the dirtiest environments imaginable. The open bucket was not just a container, it was a magnet for contamination. The wide surface gave every passing particle an invitation to land. Flies, in particular, were relentless. They swarmed the buckets, drawn by the sweetness of the milk, landing and leaving behind whatever filth they had just collected from dung heaps or garbage piles. Some drowned, some crawled away, but all carried bacteria into the drink. Imagine scooping a ladle of milk with a dead fly floating on top. For us, it is revolting. For them, it was normal. People skimmed insects off the surface and carried on, never questioning what invisible traces had already dissolved into the liquid, and the streets themselves added their own special ingredients. Dust was constant, kicked up by horses and wagons, settling like a thin layer of gray on everything. Each gust of wind sprinkled more dirt into the buckets. In industrial cities, this dust was not just soil, it was coal ash, soot, and metallic particles from factories. Every spoonful of milk carried not just bacteria, but tiny fragments of the Industrial Revolution itself. It is almost comical in a macabre way. While politicians boasted of progress and modernity, families were literally drinking coal dust in their morning porridge. The journey from farm to city made matters worse. Many dairies were located miles outside urban centers, so milk traveled long distances in wagons. With no refrigeration, the milk warmed under the sun as the buckets sloshed back and forth. By the time it reached the city gates, it was already halfway to sour. But instead of discarding it, vendors pushed forward, eager to sell before the smell gave them away. Customers waiting at their doors rarely hesitated. The milk was ladled into their pitchers as if the hours of exposure to dust, heat, and filth meant nothing. In a sense, milk was consumed not just as food, but as an act of blind faith in the system that delivered it. Think of how buyers interacted with this system. Families brought their own containers, dipping them into the communal bucket right there in the street. Each hand, each jug added more contamination. A cracked jug with old milk residue was dunked in, mixing its bacteria with the supposedly fresh supply. Then another customer did the same, and another. The result was a shared cauldron of microbes, stirred daily by the ladles of countless hands. What was sold as nourishment was, in fact, a communal experiment in spreading disease. And yet, no one objected. In fact, some considered it a social ritual, chatting with the milkman, exchanging news with neighbors, all while scooping poison into their households. This image of open transport also reveals something about human psychology. People saw what they wanted to see. They noticed the creamy whiteness of milk and ignored the dust settling on its surface. They admired the honesty of the milkman, never suspecting his buckets had already been tampered with along the way. To acknowledge the risk would have meant questioning an entire system of daily survival. It was easier to trust, easier to believe that the milk was good, even when evidence floated right on top. Trust, in this sense, became another form of contamination. Once it spread, it blinded entire communities to reality. Some reformers eventually began to document the horrors of open transport. Journalists described buckets filled not only with milk, but also with hair, straw, and insects. In New York's infamous swill milk scandal, inspectors found milk that had been transported so carelessly that it was visibly gray by the time it reached customers. Reports shocked readers, but only briefly. Habits are hard to break, and for poor families, the choice was not between safe milk and unsafe milk. It was between unsafe milk and none at all. And so the practice continued, day after day, as if knowledge itself had no power against necessity. There is a bitter comedy in imagining how milk traveled alongside other market goods. A wagon might carry open buckets of milk next to slabs of raw meat, baskets of fish, or even barrels of human waste bound for disposal. The smells mixed, the flies traveled from one to the other, and the milk absorbed everything around it. Yet once it was poured into a child's cup, it was still seen as a symbol of purity. That illusion of purity, reinforced by milk's white color, was perhaps its most dangerous feature. People believed their eyes, not their instincts. The lack of closed containers and proper transport technology did more than spread disease. It shaped cultural memory. Generations grew up associating milk with stomach pains, diarrhea, and fever, but because it happened so often, they saw it as part of life rather than a preventable danger. In many ways, the open bucket became a symbol of the precarious balance between tradition and progress. It carried not just milk, but the contradictions of a society struggling to modernize while clinging to old habits. And so every clattering cart that rolled down those cobblestone streets was more than just a delivery service. It was a rolling hazard, spreading bacteria from farm to city, from vendor to family, from child to grave. Yet it also carried the seeds of change, because the more visible the contamination became, the flies, the dust, the gray tint, the more impossible it was to ignore. And when people finally began to question the milkman's buckets, they also began to question the broader system of food safety. That small act of suspicion opened the door to a revolution in how society thought about what it consumed, which leads us naturally to the next chapter of this story. When vendors, realizing milk spoiled too quickly and looked too suspicious, began to cheat with tricks that were far worse than dust or flies. They started to stretch and disguise their product, turning milk from a risky gamble into a deliberate fraud. And that fraud would become one of the darkest scandals in the history of food. Picture a crowded city market in the mid-19th century. Vendors shout, horses clatter, the smell of fresh bread mingles with the stink of rotting refuse, and in the middle of it all stands a milkman with his pails of white liquid. But those pails do not contain only milk. In fact, a large portion of what sits inside them is water drawn from wells, pumps, or even cisterns that no one in their right mind would drink by itself. The milk is no longer pure. It is a mixture, carefully disguised to look whole. The motive is simple: profit. Every extra drop of water stretches the supply, and every extra cup sold brings more money to the vendor. But hidden in that economic trick is a betrayal of the most intimate kind, because families believed they were buying nourishment for their children when they were in fact buying poison. Hit subscribe and save this video. Knowledge doesn't expire. Only milk does. By the way, what's the time on your clock right now? Comment it, and let's map out this timeline of milk lovers. The irony is sharp. People avoided water because they knew it carried disease. Wells were often contaminated by sewage, rivers ran thick with industrial waste, and urban pumps sometimes delivered liquid tinged with the color of rust. Yet when that same water was poured into milk, its dangers vanished from sight. The whiteness of milk covered all sins. Mothers who would never hand their children a cup of water from the street pump did so gladly once that same water was hidden inside milk. It is one of history's cruelest jokes. Disguise the danger in something trusted, and people will swallow it without question. This deception was not rare, it was routine. In cities like New York, London, and Paris, investigations revealed that entire neighborhoods consumed milk that was often more water than cow's product. And the water was not boiled, not filtered, not treated. It came straight from pumps fouled by human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff. Some vendors even filled their buckets directly from streams running behind slaughterhouses. Imagine the horror of that reality. Milk carrying not only bacteria, but also traces of blood, offal, and chemicals. And still, customers lined up each morning with their jugs, paying precious coins for the privilege of being deceived. The scandal became impossible to ignore when mortality statistics rose. Physicians began to notice that outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, and dysentery often followed patterns of milk consumption. Children were especially vulnerable. An infant fed diluted milk could weaken within hours, their tiny body overwhelmed not by malnutrition, but by infection. Whole families buried children without ever suspecting that the trusted milkman at their door had handed them death. The tragedy lay not only in the sickness, but in the silence. Because families rarely questioned milk, they blamed fate, weather, or divine punishment. The real culprit went unchallenged. What makes this story even darker is that dilution was often only the beginning. Once milk was watered down, it lost its creamy color and began to look thin and bluish. Customers might complain, and so vendors invented tricks. Chalk was added to restore whiteness, starch to thicken it, molasses to give it flavor, and sometimes plaster powder or even whitening agents meant for laundry. These additions were not meant to nourish, but to deceive the eye. So the glass of milk given to a sick child might contain not just contaminated water, but chalk dust or soap residue. This was not milk anymore. It was theater, a performance of purity staged for survival and profit. The famous swill milk scandal in New York during the 1850s exposed these practices to the public. Reporters discovered that dairies were feeding cows leftover grain mash from whiskey distilleries, producing weak, diseased animals whose milk was already poor in quality. To make matters worse, vendors diluted this thin milk with dirty water and doctored it with chemicals to disguise the fraud. The result was a citywide epidemic of child deaths. Newspapers printed shocking illustrations of skeleton-like infants, their bodies wasted by what was supposed to nourish them. The outrage shook society, but the scandal was only one example among many. Across Europe and America, the same practices were taking place in silence. The psychology behind the fraud is worth considering. Vendors did not always see themselves as villains. They told themselves that dilution allowed more families to access milk, that they were serving the poor who could not afford pure supplies. Some even claimed they were doing a kind of charity by stretching what little they had. But this justification collapses when confronted with the bodies of dead children. Profit was the real motive, and compassion was only an excuse. It is a reminder of how easily humans disguise greed with moral language, convincing themselves they are helping, even as they harm. For families, the effects were devastating. Malnourishment combined with infection created a cycle of weakness that trapped entire households. Children fed diluted milk often grew slower, looked frailer, and were more likely to die young. Adults suffered too, with repeated bouts of diarrhea and fever leaving them unable to work. In a society already struggling with poverty and overcrowding, the burden of constant illness deepened misery, and all of it began with the simple act of pouring water into milk. There is a bitter comedy in the way people reacted when the truth began to surface. Instead of abandoning milk, many simply demanded stricter oversight of vendors. They still wanted milk. They could not imagine life without it, but they wanted guarantees it was real. The trust was shaken, but not broken. Milk retained its place at the table, even though it had betrayed them countless times. Perhaps that is the most human element of all, the refusal to let go of something dangerous because the alternative feels worse. But as scandals grew, so did calls for reform. Scientists and reformers began to argue for pasteurization, for inspections, for sealed containers and regulated dairies. Yet the road to change was long, and in the meantime, milk continued to be stretched, disguised, and sold in forms barely recognizable as food. The story of watered milk is not only about deception, it is about the slow awakening of society to the idea that what looked safe could, in truth, be the deadliest thing on the table. And once people realized how far vendors were willing to go to stretch milk with dirty water, the next question emerged naturally. If they could dilute and disguise so easily, what other substances might they secretly add to preserve profits? That suspicion, once planted, would uncover an even darker chapter in the history of milk. Imagine standing at a street corner in a bustling 19th century city. A milkman ladles a white liquid from a heavy tin can into your jug, smiling as if offering nourishment straight from the countryside. But what you are buying is no longer milk in the sense nature intended. Somewhere along the chain, from farm to vendor, it has been stretched with water and then repaired with substances that belong in a mason's toolkit rather than a child's cup. Chalk, plaster, starch, and even lime were poured into milk, not to improve it, but to trick the eye and the tongue. The result was a liquid that looked wholesome but carried the hidden signature of fraud and danger. The logic was crude but effective. Watering milk made it pale and bluish, instantly recognizable as diluted. Customers might refuse to buy it, so vendors improvised. A pinch of chalk or plaster restored the white opacity, fooling the senses into believing it was rich and creamy again. Starch thickened the texture, masking the fact that the cream had been stretched too thin. Some even used molasses to give an illusion of sweetness. It was not nutrition, it was theater, a performance staged inside every jug, where customers were the audience and bacteria were the silent actors waiting to deliver the final act. What makes this deception particularly grotesque is the audience it targeted. The poor were the most frequent victims. Wealthier families could sometimes buy milk directly from trusted dairies or keep their own cows, but urban workers had no choice but to depend on street vendors. Mothers carrying infants, families struggling to feed several children, the sick and elderly hoping for strength. All of them received milk doctored with chemicals never meant for human consumption. Chalk may not sound deadly at first, but combined with contaminated water and bacteria, it contributed to waves of diarrhea, cramping, and malnutrition. And lime, in particular, could burn delicate stomach linings. What was sold as sustenance became slow poison. The irony is that these additives were not hidden in laboratories or secret storerooms. They were bought in the same markets where milk was sold. Chalk was plentiful, used in construction and cleaning. Plaster was a common household material. Vendors knew exactly where to find cheap supplies, and no law stopped them from mixing them into food. The casualness of it all is striking. Imagine scooping powder from a builder's bag, stirring it into milk, and then handing it to a mother cradling her child. For us, the act seems unthinkable. For them, it was business. Some scandals became legendary. In London, inspectors discovered milk with such high chalk content that it left sediment at the bottom of cups, like mud in water. In New York, entire dairies were exposed for using plaster of Paris as a whitening agent. Newspaper articles described children with stomachs bloated not from nutrition, but from indigestible powders. And yet, these reports did not always reduce demand. Milk was too deeply woven into daily life. People shook their heads at the scandals, cursed dishonest vendors, and then bought another jug from a different corner, hoping it would somehow be better. There's a dark comedy in how society rationalized these practices. Some argued that chalk was harmless, pointing out that it was already used in medicines. Others claimed that starch was merely food in another form, nothing to worry about. These excuses served to soothe consciences, not to protect health. And the public often wanted to believe them. After all, to accept the full truth, that milk was systematically corrupted, was to admit that an entire generation of children had been weakened or killed by what was supposed to save them. Denial was easier than facing the weight of betrayal. But the body cannot be tricked so easily. Chalk did not turn into calcium that strengthened bones, it clogged intestines. Lime did not refresh, it corroded. Starch did not add creaminess, it starved. Every sip of doctored milk robbed people of real nourishment and replaced it with irritation, weakness, and disease. The deception was not only moral but biological, altering the very development of children raised on such milk. Generations grew with weaker constitutions. The blame was placed on poverty or frail nature, when in truth it was the fraudulent cup placed on their table each morning. And yet the system continued, fueled by the desperation of vendors and the blind faith of buyers. It is unsettling to realize how far humans will go to preserve appearances. Vendors wanted milk to look white because white meant pure. Buyers wanted to see creaminess because cream meant health. Both sides colluded, unconsciously, in sustaining the illusion. In that collusion, fraud flourished. It is a reminder that deception often survives not because people don't know, but because they don't want to know. Eventually, public outrage grew. Investigations exposed the scale of the fraud, and reformers pushed for regulations that demanded inspections, sealed containers, and laboratory tests. The birth of modern food safety owes much to the scandal of adulterated milk. But before those victories, entire communities lived and died inside the lie. Milk was no longer just a drink. It was a mirror reflecting the collision of greed, necessity, and ignorance. And when that mirror finally shattered, society had to confront not only what vendors had done, but what people themselves had chosen to ignore. Which leads naturally to the next question. If milk could be corrupted so easily by human hands with chalk and plaster, what about the creatures that produced it? Because behind every bucket of milk stood animals, whose own conditions often shaped the dangers hidden inside. And that next revelation would be even more disturbing. Picture a hot summer afternoon in the heart of a 19th century city. The air is thick with the smell of horse manure, rotting vegetables, and smoke from coal fires. The marketplace buzzes, not only with voices, but with the endless hum of flies. They swarm everywhere, around open barrels of fish, over heaps of discarded fruit, on the lips of babies sleeping in prams. And where do they land most eagerly? On the wide, open surfaces of milk pails, gleaming white and sweet under the sun. For the flies, this was paradise. food, moisture, and a place to lay their eggs. For the families who bought the milk, it was a silent curse poured into every cup. Flies were not just a nuisance, they were disease carriers. Landing on a pile of manure one moment and a milk bucket the next, they transferred filth with frightening efficiency. Each fly carried countless bacteria on its feet and in its body. When they fell into the milk, some drowned, releasing their contents directly into the liquid. Others crawled away, leaving invisible traces behind. The average person saw only a speck floating on the surface and skimmed it off, thinking the problem solved. But the real danger was microscopic, dissolved into the milk long before anyone noticed. It's unsettling to realize that a single cup of milk could carry the unseen footprints of dozens of flies that had traveled from the filthiest corners of the city. There's a kind of grim comedy in how casually people dealt with this. Housewives skimmed flies off milk with the same indifference we brush crumbs from a table. Vendors shrugged when asked about insects floating in their cans, sometimes joking that flies like the good stuff. The normalization of contamination reveals how people adapt to danger when it becomes too common to fight. After all, flies were everywhere. To banish them from milk would have meant changing the entire system of food distribution. So instead of solving the problem, people simply ignored it. The irony deepens when we consider how much energy people spent protecting other foods. Bread was carefully wrapped, meat was salted or smoked, water was boiled. But milk, which spoiled faster and attracted flies more aggressively, was left uncovered in buckets on market stalls. It's almost as if people trusted milk's whiteness to shield it from contamination, as though purity could be preserved by appearance alone. This blindness was fatal. Historical accounts are filled with outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery traced directly to contaminated milk. Flies were often the invisible couriers delivering those illnesses, yet rarely did anyone suspect them. Children once again bore the heaviest cost. Their cups of milk, given as symbols of care, were often swimming with invisible pathogens. A child might drink in the morning and by evening suffer fever, diarrhea, and dehydration. Families watched helplessly as their little ones wasted away, blaming the heat, summer complaints, or fate. Few made the connection to the flies they swatted away every day. It is tragic to imagine that something so visible, flies buzzing in every corner, remained invisible as a threat. Sometimes the deadliest dangers are the ones we convince ourselves are just background noise. And it wasn't only homes that suffered. Institutions like schools, orphanages, and hospitals relied heavily on milk deliveries. Open cans of milk stood in kitchens, often surrounded by swarms of insects. The very places meant to protect society's most vulnerable became breeding grounds for disease. Reports from the time describe entire wards of children in hospitals struck by sudden illness, later traced back to milk supplies crawling with fly larvae. That is another haunting detail. It wasn't just adult flies contaminating milk. Their eggs, invisible when dropped into the liquid, could hatch into larvae if the milk stood too long. Imagine a spoon dipping into milk only to stir up tiny wriggling creatures. Disgusting to us today, but at the time it was simply another inconvenience. The story of flies in milk reveals something fundamental about human denial. People saw the insects but did not want to believe their presence meant danger. To admit it would have meant rejecting milk altogether, and that was unthinkable. Instead, they built small rituals to manage their discomfort. Skimming the surface, adding sugar to mask the taste, boiling only when illness struck. These half measures gave the illusion of control while leaving the real danger untouched. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. When survival depends on something unsafe, people invent stories to make the unsafe feel tolerable. And yet, not everyone accepted this complacency. Reformers began to speak out, pointing to the obvious connection between flies, filth, and outbreaks of disease. Some cities experimented with covering milk cans or demanding tighter lids. Others encouraged boiling milk, though many resisted, believing it ruined the taste. Change was slow because habit and tradition held firm. Milk was more than food. It was culture, routine, comfort. And comfort is hard to abandon, even in the face of evidence. Still, as the awareness grew, people began to ask harder questions. If flies could so easily turn milk into poison, what about the larger environment in which milk was handled? The streets, the markets, the carts, were they not just as guilty as the insects? The milkman's bucket was not the only open door for contamination. In fact, the entire urban system of transport and sale was built on exposure. And once people began to suspect the system itself, the foundations of trust began to crack in ways that could not be ignored. Imagine the morning routine of a family in the late 19th century. A mother pours milk into her child's cup, stirring it into porridge with a gentle hand. The child, still half asleep, takes each spoonful with trust, unaware that every bite carries not only nourishment but danger. By noon, the child complains of stomach cramps. By evening, they are feverish, weak, and unable to keep water down. And by night, the parents stand over a sickbed, terrified that their child may not live to see the dawn. This was the cruel rhythm of milk. The very food meant to strengthen the young often betrayed them within hours. The speed of this betrayal shocked families. Bread might mold slowly, meat might smell bad after days, but milk carried its punishment swiftly. Doctors described children who drank in the morning and died within 24 hours from diarrhea and dehydration. The condition was given a deceptively soft name, summer complaint. But behind the phrase lay endless graves of infants and toddlers lost to milk-borne illness. The tragedy was sharpened by irony. Mothers turned to milk because they believed it safe, more nourishing than water, gentler than meat, and a perfect substitute for breast milk. In reality, it was often the most lethal thing they could give. The statistics were horrifying. In cities like New York, records showed that up to half of all infant deaths in summer were linked to spoiled or adulterated milk. Orphanages reported entire wards struck with sudden sickness after being fed from the same batch. Physicians tried to explain the connection, but without knowledge of bacteria, they were left with vague theories about bad air or the weakness of children's stomachs. Families comforted themselves with fatalistic phrases like, "God took the child," or "the summer heat was too much." Rarely did anyone blame the jug of milk sitting in the kitchen, though it was the silent killer in plain sight. This tragedy becomes even more chilling when we realize how avoidable many cases were. Boiling milk could have saved lives, but people resisted it. They claimed boiling ruined the flavor, made it dead or heavy. Some even feared it removed the very essence of milk's nourishment. Others simply lacked the fuel to boil large quantities daily. So families carried on, trusting raw milk, convinced that freshness was enough. It was a fatal misunderstanding. Freshness did not mean safety, not when milk had traveled in open buckets through filthy streets or been watered down with contaminated sources. One haunting detail appears in diaries of the era. Mothers wrote of buying milk for a sick child as a last hope when nothing else could be digested. They spoon-fed it with tenderness, believing it was the gentlest cure. Hours later, the child was worse, and within days, sometimes gone. The milk that was supposed to heal became the executioner. There is a cruel poetry in this, as if life itself mocked the very instinct to nurture. It is difficult not to see it as one of the most bitter betrayals of trust in history. The problem was not confined to the poor, though they suffered most. Middle-class families also lost children to milk-borne diseases, despite paying higher prices for supposedly better quality. Vendors knew how to deceive: chalk to whiten, starch to thicken, ice cut from polluted rivers to keep it cool. Wealth did not guarantee safety, it only guaranteed fancier lies. The grim equality of milk-borne illness united rich and poor in grief, though only the wealthy had the voice to demand reform. Their outrage eventually pushed for change, but by then, countless children had already been buried. There's a dark comedy in how people clung to hope, even as patterns repeated themselves. A family might lose one child after a summer of illness, only to continue feeding milk to the next baby the following year. They told themselves it must have been fate, or weakness, or bad luck. To suspect the milk would have meant questioning an entire way of life, a staple of diet and culture. And humans are stubborn in their comforts. They prefer to grieve than to abandon tradition. Milk retained its halo of purity even while it dug countless graves. Doctors eventually began to suspect milk more directly, especially as they observed how quickly symptoms appeared after drinking it. They noted the difference between children who were breastfed and those who relied on cow's milk. Mortality was far higher in the latter. Some urged boiling or diluting with safe water, but the message spread slowly. The resistance to change shows how culture can be deadlier than disease. People trusted the ritual of milk too deeply to give it up, even when evidence mounted before their eyes. What makes this chapter of history so striking is how intimate the betrayal was. It wasn't a distant plague carried by strangers. It was poured by a mother's own hand into her child's cup. The act of love itself became the mechanism of harm. That emotional contradiction cut deeper than any statistic, because it meant no amount of care or affection could protect a child from what was hidden in milk. Love could not overcome microbes, and that reality broke countless families. And yet, this very cycle of grief planted seeds of change. Outrage at child deaths became fuel for reformers and scientists who demanded safer milk. Journalists published exposés on adulteration, doctors spoke out about infant mortality, and inventors searched for ways to keep milk safe. The pain of watching children fall ill within hours of drinking milk became the catalyst for revolutions in public health. But before those revolutions, society had to endure decades of loss, repeating the same mistakes, trusting the same jugs, and mourning the same swift descent from nourishment to death. And that leads to the next inevitable realization. If children were falling sick so quickly, how many adults were also weakened by daily doses of contaminated milk, but survived long enough to spread the damage across generations? Because milk was not just a children's drink. It was on every table, every morning, waiting to betray not just the young, but everyone who dared to trust it. Close your eyes and picture the symbolism of milk in the 19th century. To most families, it wasn't just a food, it was a symbol of purity itself. White, clean, and straight from nature, it carried a moral weight that few other foods could claim. Bread could mold, meat could rot, water could stink, but milk remained wrapped in an aura of innocence. Mothers spoke of it as the perfect food, Physicians prescribed it as medicine, and reformers wrote about it as the backbone of moral and physical strength. To question milk was, in many ways, to question the very idea of purity in daily life. The whiteness of milk was its most powerful deception. Color became proof of safety in a world where people judged food by sight and smell alone. If it was white, it was clean. If it smelled sweet, it was safe. People rarely imagined that bacteria could hide in something that looked so flawless. In fact, they clung to the illusion so tightly that they often ignored evidence of sickness directly linked to milk. A child might fall ill hours after drinking it, but the explanation was always sought elsewhere. Bad weather, weak constitution, or divine will. Milk's purity was unquestionable, and purity cannot be guilty. This belief was strengthened by culture and tradition. In religious symbolism, milk was associated with innocence, abundance, and divine promise, a land flowing with milk and honey. In folklore, it was linked with maternal care and natural strength. These associations ran so deep that they shaped how people reacted to evidence of harm. To admit that milk could kill was to admit that nature itself had betrayed them, and rather than confront that, most people chose to preserve the myth. It was easier to bury a child and blame fate than to destroy the cultural pedestal on which milk stood. Doctors, too, were complicit in this belief. Even as some began to notice the link between milk and outbreaks of disease, others continued to prescribe it as a cure. Weak patients were instructed to drink fresh milk to restore their health. Infants unable to breastfeed were given cow's milk as a substitute. The contradiction was almost absurd. The very substance that carried disease was prescribed as medicine against it. But this absurdity persisted because of the deep cultural faith in milk's natural goodness. To the medical establishment of the time, pure milk was not a hypothesis, it was a doctrine. There's a dark comedy here that feels almost Shakespearean. Imagine a family rushing to buy milk from the vendor because their child is ill, believing that a cup of pure milk will bring strength. Hours later, the same child lies weaker than before, stricken not by the illness they already had, but by the very cure administered in love. It is as if milk played the role of both doctor and assassin, a character wrapped in white robes of innocence while carrying a dagger hidden beneath. The audience, the families, refused to see the dagger because they could not bear to question the healer. The strength of this belief also reveals how humans cope with uncertainty. In a world filled with danger, dirty streets, polluted water, unpredictable diseases, people needed anchors of trust. Milk became one of those anchors. By declaring it pure, by convincing themselves it was always safe, they created a sense of stability in an unstable world. Even if it betrayed them, they clung to the idea because to abandon it would have left them adrift in chaos. It was less frightening to trust milk and suffer than to admit that nothing in their daily lives could be trusted at all. And yet, cracks in the illusion began to appear. Journalists uncovered scandals of watered milk, chalk additives, and diseased cows. Reformers shouted that the so-called pure milk sold in cities was anything but pure. But the resistance was fierce. Vendors defended their trade, customers defended their traditions, and even politicians hesitated to attack milk's reputation too directly. No one wanted to be the villain who destroyed the comforting image of milk as nature's perfect gift. The belief in purity was stronger than the evidence of harm, at least for a time. The tragedy is that this faith in purity delayed the very reforms that could have saved lives. Because people trusted milk so blindly, they resisted boiling it, resisted regulation, resisted scientific intervention. The myth of purity acted like a shield, protecting milk not from bacteria but from scrutiny. And in that shield's shadow, children died, families grieved, and epidemics spread unchecked. Faith can be powerful, but when misplaced, it becomes a weapon against those who hold it. Even today, echoes of this belief linger. We still associate whiteness with cleanliness, nature with safety, tradition with truth. We still cling to illusions that certain foods or practices are inherently pure, ignoring evidence to the contrary. The story of milk's false purity is not just history, it is a mirror reflecting our own modern habits. What do we trust too easily because it looks good, smells right, or feels natural? The answer is often uncomfortable. And as people of the past slowly began to realize that milk's purity was an illusion, they faced a harsher question. If milk could betray them so profoundly, what else in their daily lives, trusted without question, might also be a silent killer? That doubt, once planted, began to spread beyond milk, touching every corner of the food supply and paving the way for a revolution in how societies thought about safety itself. Imagine the kitchen of a modest 19th century home. A small iron stove burns with coal or wood, and on top of it sits a heavy pot. A woman leans over it, stirring as steam rises, the sharp smell of heating milk filling the air. She is not boiling it because she knows about bacteria or pasteurization. Those words belong to another century. She boils it because she senses something is wrong, because the milk has soured too quickly or smells odd. An instinct tells her that fire might save it. It is an act of desperation disguised as domestic routine, a ritual where science is absent but survival is improvised. Boiling milk was one of the earliest defense mechanisms families developed, though uneven and imperfect. For some, it was a superstition. Heat would drive out the bad spirits or the evil air thought to cause sickness. For others, it was a matter of taste. Boiling changed the flavor, and some households liked the richer, cooked taste. But for most, it was necessity. Milk spoiled so fast without refrigeration that boiling became a way to stretch its life just a little longer. Mothers boiled it in the morning so it would last until night, never realizing that they were accidentally fighting an invisible army of microbes. The irony is thick. Families who resisted boiling water because it was considered unnatural were more willing to boil milk, not because they understood safety, but because they hated waste. Throwing out milk was unthinkable. Every drop cost money, and every drop mattered in feeding children. So when milk curdled too quickly or smelled sour, boiling became a way to rescue it, to make it usable again in puddings, porridge, or sauces. They weren't protecting health, they were protecting the family budget. And yet, this act of thrift sometimes saved lives without anyone realizing why. Of course, the process was far from foolproof. Boiling milk could kill many bacteria, but it couldn't remove toxins already produced by microbes, nor could it erase the chalk, lime, or contaminated water vendors had added to stretch it. At best, it was a partial shield. Families who relied on boiled milk still fell sick, though sometimes less frequently than those who drank it raw. But because the connection wasn't clear, boiling became inconsistent. Some households swore by it, others swore against it, claiming it killed the goodness of the milk. Tradition and rumor decided more than evidence ever did. This uncertainty produced a strange cultural divide. In some neighborhoods, boiling milk was considered wise and careful. In others, it was mocked as unnecessary or even harmful. Housewives exchanged tips and recipes, arguing whether boiled milk made children stronger or weaker. Some claimed it hardened the stomach, others that it ruined digestion. These arguments reveal more than culinary preferences. They reveal how people struggled to understand health without science, building myths and half-truths to explain what they could not see. Boiling also shaped how milk was consumed. Once heated, it often thickened or curdled, so families turned it into puddings, custards, or clabber. Children grew up on these dishes, not realizing they were born of necessity rather than creativity. The kitchen became a laboratory of survival, where women experimented daily with ways to disguise milk that was on the verge of spoiling. Recipes passed down through generations were, in reality, survival manuals coded in tradition. A sweet custard or sour milk cake wasn't just dessert. It was evidence of how people learned to live with constant risk. But there was another layer, darker and more emotional. Boiling milk was sometimes the last act of a mother trying to save a sick child. Physicians advised that warm milk could soothe a weak stomach, so mothers stood by the stove, boiling and cooling small portions, praying that this time the milk would heal rather than harm. The cruelty of fate was that sometimes it worked and sometimes it killed. That uncertainty tore at families because how do you grieve a child when the very act of care might have been what sealed their fate? Boiling milk became a ritual heavy with love, hope, and dread. A reminder that survival often hung on choices made in ignorance. As time passed, science began to catch up with instinct. When Louis Pasteur demonstrated that heating liquids killed invisible microbes, reformers saw a way to finally explain what housewives had been doing for decades without knowing why. Pasteurization gave boiling a new dignity. It was no longer superstition or thrift, but science. And yet, acceptance was slow. Many resisted, insisting that raw milk was more natural, more authentic. This resistance echoes even into the modern era, where debates about raw milk versus pasteurized milk continue. History, it seems, never fully leaves us. The story of boiling milk teaches us something profound about human survival. People do not wait for perfect knowledge before acting. They improvise, guided by instinct, fear, and necessity. Sometimes they stumble onto truths without understanding them, as housewives did when they boiled milk to save money, unknowingly saving lives in the process. Other times, those same improvisations failed, prolonging suffering. But the pattern remains. Humans fight back against danger in whatever ways they can, even when the enemy is invisible. And yet, boiling milk also raised uncomfortable questions. If it needed to be boiled, was it really safe at all? If families had to cook it into custards and puddings just to make it tolerable, was milk truly the pure and perfect food they believed it to be? Once people started asking those questions, they began to look beyond their kitchens and toward the wider systems that delivered milk to their tables. And what they found there, in the farms, the dairies, and the marketplaces, would be even more disturbing. Imagine the fear that gripped a city when cholera arrived in the 19th century. Entire families struck down within days, neighbors collapsing on the street, bodies carried away in carts as if war had descended upon everyday life. People whispered about bad air, about divine punishment, about invisible curses drifting through the water supply. But slowly, painfully, physicians and journalists began to notice something strange. In many outbreaks, there was a quiet, almost invisible common thread: milk. The first reports were cautious. Doctors wrote in medical journals that children who drank certain batches of milk seemed to fall ill more often than those who didn't. At first, These suspicions were dismissed as coincidence. How could milk, the very symbol of purity, the food trusted above all others, be linked to a disease as terrifying as cholera? Water was already guilty, everyone agreed on that. But milk? It was unthinkable. And yet, as more cases piled up, the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Consider one story often repeated in reformist pamphlets. A single dairy supplied milk to several households in a neighborhood. Within days, almost every family fell sick with the same violent symptoms of cholera, while households that bought milk elsewhere were spared. The evidence was circumstantial, but chilling. It wasn't the air, it wasn't the streets, it was the milk jug on the table. For families who had fed that milk lovingly to their children, the realization was unbearable. The comfort they had poured each morning turned out to be the very agent of terror creeping into their homes. The connection between milk and cholera made sense once one looked at the process. Buckets of milk were routinely diluted with water to stretch supply, and that water often came from pumps or wells already contaminated with sewage. Cholera thrived in such conditions, invisible to the eye but devastating once swallowed. Milk not only carried the bacteria, but provided a perfect medium for it to multiply, sweetening the poison and ensuring its delivery into the stomachs of unsuspecting victims. In a cruel twist, milk was not just a carrier but a collaborator, amplifying the very disease it delivered. The tragedy was magnified by how quickly cholera acted. A child could drink milk in the morning and by evening be doubled over with cramps, vomiting, and violent diarrhea. By night, dehydration could be fatal. Parents were left bewildered, asking how something so innocent could betray them so brutally. The grief was compounded by guilt because the same hand that poured milk out of love was, unknowingly, the hand that delivered death. There is perhaps no deeper psychological wound than realizing that an act of care has caused harm. Reports began to spread beyond medical journals. Newspapers, always eager for shocking stories, published exposés linking outbreaks to tainted milk. They described dairies where cows were fed distillery waste, where water pumps bubbled beside cesspools, where milk cans stood open to every fly and speck of dust. One infamous illustration showed mothers ladling milk from a bucket labeled Death's Dairy, a skull grinning above it. These images struck at the public's emotions in ways statistics never could. People began to fear milk in the same way they feared water, with dread, suspicion, and anger. But fear alone did not bring change. Many resisted the idea that milk could be dangerous, clinging to the old belief in its purity. Some claimed the reports were exaggerated, inventions of journalists eager to sell papers. Others argued that milk had always been consumed and could not suddenly be guilty. The battle between tradition and evidence raged in the streets and in the press, with reformers fighting uphill against centuries of cultural trust. Yet every fresh outbreak, every new grave dug for a child, made denial harder to maintain. One of the most haunting aspects of these early reports is how preventable much of the suffering was. Simple measures, boiling milk, sourcing clean water, covering containers, could have reduced risk dramatically. But without widespread education and regulation, these measures remained patchwork solutions. Some families took them seriously, others ignored them, and so the cycle of outbreak and grief continued. The very idea that survival depended not just on personal habits, but on collective action, was radical in a world where individual households trusted their own judgment above all. Milk, in this sense, became a teacher, forcing society to learn that health could not be protected in isolation. The reports linking milk to cholera outbreaks also reveal the birth of a new way of thinking about food. For the first time, people were asked to see food not just as nourishment, but as a potential weapon in the hands of invisible forces. The dinner table became a battlefield, and the milk jug became a suspect. This shift in perception marked the beginning of modern public health, a recognition that safety could not be assumed just because something looked pure. And once that suspicion took root, it spread beyond milk to every corner of the urban diet. Yet suspicion was not enough. The real challenge was turning awareness into action, transforming fear into systems of prevention. And as societies began to reckon with the fact that milk could spread cholera, they stumbled into a larger, even more frightening discovery. Milk was not the villain of one disease, but the accomplice of many. It could carry tuberculosis, typhoid, and other killers just as efficiently, silently weaving sickness into the very fabric of daily life. What began as a whisper about cholera would soon erupt into a chorus of alarm about milk itself, forcing a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of a rapidly growing industrial city in the mid-19th century. Smoke pours from chimneys, sewage trickles through gutters, and crowds of people press shoulder to shoulder in tenements, where entire families sleep in a single room. Disease lurks everywhere, but nowhere was the betrayal more intimate than in the humble jug of milk carried into every household. By this time, suspicion had already begun to grow. Cholera, typhoid, scarlet fever, illness after illness seemed to ripple outward not from rivers or wells, but from milk sellers making their morning rounds. The connection between milk and epidemics was not immediately obvious because milk was not thought of as a dangerous substance. but doctors and reformers began to notice patterns. In one infamous case in London, a typhoid epidemic swept through dozens of households, all of them supplied by the same dairy. Another outbreak in Boston showed similar results. Entire neighborhoods, all struck with identical symptoms, traced back to a single source of milk. These were not isolated incidents. They were warnings of a systemic problem. Milk was not just a household risk anymore, it was a citywide threat. The mechanics of these outbreaks were cruelly efficient. A single infected cow, a single contaminated water pump, or a single careless vendor could unleash sickness across thousands of people in a matter of days. Because milk was distributed daily and consumed by nearly everyone, it became the perfect delivery system for pathogens. Unlike meat, which might be avoided or preserved, milk was immediate. It was drunk raw, fed to infants, poured into tea, mixed with bread. Once contaminated, it spread disease with a speed and reach that few other foods could match. Don't make a sour face, subscribe and join the fun. But first, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? I want to see people from breakfast to bedtime talking milk. The scale of loss is difficult to imagine today. Reports from New York in the 1860s recorded thousands of infant deaths each summer, many attributed to what reformers bluntly called poison milk. In Philadelphia, entire blocks of tenements reported simultaneous outbreaks of diarrhea and fever, with death rates climbing week after week. In London, scarlet fever and diphtheria swept through schools and orphanages after being introduced via milk deliveries. Each epidemic left behind not just graves, but questions. Questions that forced society to confront the hidden dangers in something once considered sacred. What makes these epidemics so haunting is how ordinary they seemed at first. Families would sit down to breakfast, pour milk into tea or porridge, and within hours the first symptoms would appear. Cramps, vomiting, fever. By evening, half the household might be stricken. The speed was terrifying, and yet the ritual of drinking milk continued. People could not imagine abandoning it because milk was too deeply woven into culture and survival. Even as the funerals multiplied, the morning milkman still made his rounds, and the jugs were still filled. Tradition proved stronger than fear, at least until reform forced a change. The irony is that milk's very reputation as the perfect food made these epidemics more devastating. People trusted it blindly, giving it to those least able to survive infection. Infants, the elderly, the sick. Milk carried disease directly into the mouths of those most vulnerable, turning care into cruelty without anyone realizing it. Reformers later called it the white peril, a phrase meant to shock society into awareness. White was supposed to mean clean, but now it meant danger. The betrayal of that color, once so comforting, left a psychological scar almost as deep as the physical losses. Public reaction to these epidemics was complex. Outrage flared when newspapers reported on contaminated dairies, but resistance remained strong. Vendors defended themselves, claiming they were victims of circumstance, while many families insisted milk could not truly be to blame. It took repeated epidemics with undeniable links to finally force action. Boards of health began inspecting dairies, demanding cleaner practices, and in some cases, shutting down vendors entirely. The milk supply, once unregulated and chaotic, began to come under scrutiny. But every step forward was paid for in lives lost, a grim exchange between ignorance and reform. One curious detail in this story is how milk epidemics changed the way society thought about food. Before this, illness was often blamed on vague concepts like bad air or miasma. But milk epidemics showed that disease could travel through something consumed daily, invisibly, silently. This realization reshaped public health thinking, paving the way for germ theory to be accepted. Milk, in other words, was not just a carrier of disease. It was a teacher, forcing humanity to see that safety required vigilance, not blind faith. And yet, as cities wrestled with epidemics tied to milk, a deeper problem emerged. The vendors and dairies themselves were often unwilling or unable to change without pressure. Profit, convenience, and tradition outweighed health. Families kept buying, vendors kept selling, and epidemics kept returning. The lesson was clear. Trust in individuals was not enough. Society needed laws, inspections, and systems of accountability. Milk had become a public matter, not a private one. And in that shift lay the seeds of modern food regulation. Still, one question haunted everyone. If epidemics could be traced to milk so consistently, what about the animals producing it? Were the cows themselves not part of the problem? The more people investigated, the more they discovered that the roots of urban epidemics did not lie only in buckets and vendors, but in the very bodies of the animals standing in filthy stalls. And that revelation would open yet another disturbing chapter in the history of milk. Imagine stepping into a 19th century urban dairy stable. The smell hits you first, a choking mixture of manure, sour feed, and damp straw. Cows stand in rows, tethered so tightly they can barely move, their hooves sinking into muck that hasn't been cleared in days. Some cough, some wheeze, some stare with dull eyes that reveal illness more clearly than any doctor's report. And yet, every morning, these very cows are milked, their buckets carried straight to city streets. Reformers and doctors pleaded for change, demanding cleaner barns, healthier animals, and better storage. But the producers resisted, clinging stubbornly to the old ways, even as evidence mounted that their practices were killing people. Why the resistance? Part of it was ignorance. Many farmers and dairymen genuinely did not believe in germs. They could not see bacteria, so they dismissed the warnings as exaggerations. To them, milk had been produced the same way for generations. Why should they change now? But part of it was economics. Hygiene cost money. Cleaning barns daily required labor, improving feed required investment, covering and transporting milk required better containers. Each of these changes threatened to eat into already slim profits. For producers, the choice seemed simple: cling to tradition, ignore the reformers, and hope the public would keep buying. There's a dark comedy in the excuses dairymen made. When confronted about sick cows, they argued that a little cough never hurt the milk. When asked to clean stalls, they said that manure was natural and therefore harmless. Some even insisted that flies landing on buckets added flavor. These absurd defenses were less about belief and more about survival. Admitting the truth meant admitting responsibility, and responsibility meant cost. Better to laugh at reformers than to face ruin. The clash between reformers and producers often played out in the newspapers. Journalists published exposés describing dairies where cows were fed distillery waste until their flesh turned blue and their milk thin as water. Doctors warned that typhoid and tuberculosis were spreading through urban milk, but producers counterattacked, accusing reformers of fear-mongering and threatening their livelihoods. They rallied around the argument that milk had always been consumed, that people had always survived, and that change was unnecessary. Tradition became their shield, wielded not only against science, but against progress itself. This resistance had devastating consequences. Outbreak after outbreak claimed lives, yet producers refused to adapt. Families demanded answers, but the system remained stubbornly the same. Inspectors who visited dairies often found themselves outnumbered by angry farmers who insisted their practices were good enough. Reformers were portrayed as radicals, interfering with honest labor. And while debates raged, children continued to die from diseases carried in milk. The cost of resistance was not measured in coins, but in coffins. At the heart of this struggle was a fundamental question. Who bears responsibility for public health? Producers argued that once milk left the cow, it was no longer their concern. If families became sick, it was blamed on the child's weakness, the season, or even God's will. But reformers insisted that the chain of contamination began at the source, in the barns and stalls where milk was produced. This battle of accountability was not just about milk. It was about the very idea of collective responsibility in an industrializing world. One telling example comes from New York's infamous swill milk scandal. When investigators exposed dairies feeding cows the leftover mash from whiskey distilleries, producing diseased animals and toxic milk, the owners defended themselves by saying they were recycling waste and feeding the poor. They painted themselves as public benefactors rather than culprits. The public outrage was immense, but the producers' refusal to admit fault shows how deeply resistance was rooted not in ignorance alone, but in a determination to protect profit and reputation at any cost. Even small improvements were fought bitterly. The idea of covering milk cans to keep out dust and flies was dismissed as unnecessary. Washing hands before milking was ridiculed as fussy and womanly. Bringing fresh straw into barns was seen as a waste of time. Reformers were mocked for trying to turn honest farming into a science experiment. And yet, beneath the mockery lay fear that acknowledging the truth would unravel the very system on which their livelihoods depended. There is a tragic irony in this resistance. By refusing to adopt hygiene, producers prolonged the very crises that fueled reform. Each new epidemic, each new scandal, chipped away at public trust. Eventually, laws and regulations would be forced upon them, stripping away the very autonomy they fought so hard to protect. In resisting change, they ensured that change would come not gently, but through confrontation and compulsion. It is a lesson repeated throughout history. When those in power refuse responsibility, reform arrives with a heavier hand. And yet, the story does not end there. Because once producers were finally pressured into improving hygiene, a new question emerged. Would the public itself accept the changes? People were attached to the idea of raw milk, unaltered and natural. Reformers might force producers to clean barns, but convincing families to change how they consumed milk would be another battle entirely. And that resistance, from the very people milk was meant to protect, would shape the next stage of this unsettling story. Step into the streets of a bustling 19th century city, and you will notice something striking. There are no inspectors checking the food stalls, no regulations governing how milk, meat, or bread is sold, no standardized rules to protect buyers from fraud or filth. Milk, in particular, flowed through this vacuum of law. It was ladled from open buckets into household jugs with no oversight whatsoever, and the vendors who sold it operated in a world where deception was not only easy but almost expected. The The absence of sanitary laws created an environment where milk could be stretched, spoiled, or outright poisoned without consequence, leaving families at the mercy of trust and chance. The very concept of government oversight was alien to many people of the time. Food was seen as a private matter, a transaction between buyer and seller. If milk turned sour or made a child sick, it was dismissed as bad luck, not negligence. Even when entire neighborhoods fell ill, authorities were slow to connect the dots, partly because the machinery of public health barely existed. Cities might have rudimentary boards of health, but these focused on quarantining ships or fumigating houses after outbreaks, not inspecting what went into people's stomachs every day. Milk slipped under the radar because it seemed too ordinary, too natural to be dangerous. This lack of oversight created a perfect breeding ground for corruption. Vendors watered down milk with whatever was available, sometimes clean, often filthy. They added chalk, starch, or even plaster to restore color, and no law forbade it. Dairymen housed sick cows in squalid barns, feeding them distillery waste that made their milk thin and bluish, and no inspector ever came to stop them. In fact, the very idea that the government might interfere in such practices struck many as absurd. Food was tradition, not science, and tradition was not something to be regulated. There is something almost comic, if it weren't so tragic, about how open the fraud was. Newspapers reported vendors caught with buckets that smelled of lime or formaldehyde, substances added to keep spoiled milk from curdling, and yet prosecutions were rare. Without clear laws, punishment was nearly impossible. At most, vendors might be fined for cheating customers out of value, but never for endangering lives. The legal system cared more about economic honesty than public health. In that sense, milk was treated like any other commodity, no different from cloth or coal. Its dangers were invisible and therefore ignored. The consequences were devastating. Infant mortality soared in cities with milk-borne diseases like typhoid, cholera, and tuberculosis claiming thousands of lives each year. Reformers begged for stricter laws, pointing to statistical evidence, but their appeals often fell on deaf ears. Politicians feared angering powerful agricultural interests, and many believed regulation would strangle honest trade. The poor suffered most because they had no choice but to buy from the cheapest, least trustworthy vendors. Wealthier families sometimes avoided the danger by keeping their own cows or buying directly from trusted farms, but the urban poor were trapped in a cycle of dependency and sickness. One of the more curious episodes of this lawless era was the rise of the so-called swill milk dairies in New York. These operations fed cows leftover grain mash from whiskey distilleries, keeping them chained in filthy stalls. The milk produced was watery, bluish, and foul-smelling. To disguise it, vendors diluted it further and added chemicals for color and flavor. When reformers exposed the practice, the public was horrified, but the dairymen were technically breaking no laws. Without sanitary codes, without inspectors empowered to act, the scandal could continue for years. Outrage filled newspapers, but outrage alone could not save the children dying in tenements. This absence of regulation also shaped how people thought about blame. When a child died after drinking spoiled milk, parents often blamed themselves for not being careful enough, or accepted it as God's will. Rarely did they point fingers at the vendors or dairies because there was no cultural framework for holding them accountable. Milk was considered part of nature, and nature was unpredictable. Only later, when laws were finally introduced, did society begin to understand that safety could be designed, not left to chance. The slow arrival of food inspection laws marked a turning point. By the late 19th century, some cities began requiring dairies to register, to keep stalls cleaner, to cover milk during transport. Inspectors tested milk with chemical drops to detect chalk or starch. And these measures, primitive as they were, began to shift the balance. For the first time, consumers had a form of protection beyond their own instincts. But getting to that point required decades of suffering and relentless advocacy by reformers who were dismissed as alarmists or radicals. There is a lesson here that extends beyond history. Whenever laws are absent, the vulnerable pay the price. In the case of milk, it was children in tenements, babies in orphanages, and the sick in hospitals who bore the brunt of negligence. The vendors profited, the producers resisted change, and governments hesitated, while the weakest bodies carried the heaviest consequences. Public health, as a concept, was born out of this imbalance, a recognition that survival cannot depend solely on individual choice when the system itself is unsafe. And yet, once the first sanitary laws appeared, a new problem arose. Rules were only as strong as their enforcement, and enforcement often lagged behind. Inspectors were few, bribery was common, and entire neighborhoods still slipped through the cracks. Milk might be safer in theory, but in practice, danger lingered, which leads us to the next stage of this story, the cost of progress. Because even when laws existed, milk remained more expensive when it was clean, and that simple economic fact forced families to make impossible choices between safety and survival. Picture the daily choices of a poor family in a European city during the 19th century. The father comes home after a long day at the factory, his pockets heavy with only a few coins. On the table sits his wife, calculating carefully. Should they buy fresh milk for the children or stretch those coins on something cheaper that could feed everyone? The cruel irony was that in many urban centers, milk cost more than beer, sometimes even more than wine. A drink that should have been a basic staple of childhood was, for many, a luxury beyond reach. This paradox was born of logistics and scarcity. Beer and wine were produced locally in massive quantities, fermented to last longer, and often considered safer than water. Milk, on the other hand, spoiled within hours, required constant resupply, and had to be transported from farms into cities daily. By the time it reached the poor tenements, it was already expensive and often already spoiled. So, when a mother stood at a street stall, staring at the cloudy liquid in a jug and calculating its price against a cheap mug of beer, milk lost the competition more often than not. The consequences were brutal. Children were the ones most in need of milk, yet they were the least likely to get it consistently. Beer was sometimes watered down and given even to young ones because it was cheaper and considered safe compared to untreated water. Imagine a toddler sipping weak beer because the family could not afford milk. For us, it sounds absurd, even negligent, but for them, it was survival. Families were not choosing between nourishment and indulgence. They were choosing between two forms of risk, and milk's high cost often tipped the scale. One darkly humorous detail often mentioned in reformist pamphlets was that in some neighborhoods, laborers would drink beer in the morning because it was cheaper and easier to find than fresh milk. The image is striking. Children starting their day with thin porridge made with beer instead of milk, while their fathers washed down bread with ale. Reformers used this to argue that society was upside down. What should have been the drink of innocence was outpriced by the drink of vice. The tavern thrived, while the milk vendor struggled. Of course, the high cost of milk also encouraged fraud. Vendors realized that the poor would only buy if prices were low, so they watered it down, stretched it, or sold leftovers from the previous day. This created a vicious cycle. Families paid precious coins for milk that was already dangerous, then avoided milk altogether when their children fell ill, which only reinforced the market for adulterated versions. Milk's reputation suffered, and wine and beer grew even more dominant as the default beverages of the working class. In many cities, public health statistics show this clearly. Alcohol consumption per capita often exceeded milk consumption, even for children. The contrast between milk and beer reveals much about culture as well as economics. Beer and wine had been central to European diets for centuries, seen not only as drinks, but as symbols of community. Milk, in contrast, was associated with childhood, weakness, and rural life. When it entered urban markets, it carried none of beer's cultural prestige, but all of its logistical challenges. Families might see milk as desirable for babies, but once those babies were weaned, the drink quickly faded from the diet. Beer filled the gap, cheaper, safer in appearance, and woven into tradition. The reformers fought to change this perception, emphasizing milk as the foundation of health, especially for children. But their battle was uphill, because money speaks louder than ideals. When a family could buy a whole jug of beer for the price of a small amount of milk, the decision was not philosophical, it was practical. Reformers might warn about the dangers of alcohol for children, but hunger made those warnings sound hollow. A full stomach, even filled with beer-soaked bread, was better than an empty one with the promise of pure milk no one could afford. This economic imbalance shaped urban diets for generations. Malnutrition became widespread, not only because of scarcity, but because of substitution. Families survived on bread, beer, and occasional scraps of meat, while milk remained a rarity except for infants. And when those infants were weaned too early because families couldn't afford enough milk, they often grew sickly, setting the stage for high child mortality rates. Milk was supposed to be the food of life, but its price turned it into a privilege, a symbol of inequality as much as nourishment. It is striking to reflect on how this distorted the very idea of health. Today, we assume milk is cheap, accessible, even overproduced. But in the 19th century, the idea of a poor child drinking milk daily was almost utopian. Public health advocates used this image deliberately, painting pictures of healthy, rosy-cheeked children drinking milk as a contrast to the pale, thin children raised on bread and beer. These images became powerful tools for reform, but they also highlighted the cruel truth. Fresh milk was not just food, it was wealth. And yet, even when laws and infrastructure began to improve access, a new problem emerged. Milk that was truly fresh and clean often remained more expensive, while the poor were still left with adulterated or unsafe versions. In other words, laws did not erase inequality, they often highlighted it. A wealthy family could buy milk from a trusted dairy, but the poor still had to take their chances with the cheapest jug on the corner. Which raises the next unsettling question. If clean milk was only available to those who could pay, how could society ever claim that reforms had truly solved the problem? Picture a dimly lit tenement room in New York, London, or Paris around 1870. A mother cradles her infant, her face etched with exhaustion. She has no choice but to wean her baby earlier than nature intended. Industrial work demands her presence in the factory, long hours leave her unable to nurse, and poverty forces her to return to labor almost immediately after childbirth. The alternative to breastfeeding is cow's milk purchased from a street vendor. It is poured into a bottle with a long rubber tube, nicknamed the murder bottle by reformers, that the child can suck on throughout the day. It seems practical, even loving. Yet hidden in that milk are bacteria, chemicals, and filth that turn an act of care into an act of unintentional harm. The tragedy of weaning onto contaminated milk was one of the darkest chapters of the urban 19th century. Breastfeeding, while natural and free, was often discouraged among the poor because women needed to work, and among the wealthy because wet nurses or artificial feeding were seen as fashionable. Doctors even sometimes recommended cow's milk as a superior or more scientific option. The result was a generation of infants introduced to milk that was not only unfit, but deadly. Mortality rates soared, with infants under 1-year-old dying in staggering numbers. In some cities, 1 in 3 babies did not survive their first year, and milk was frequently the culprit. The bottles themselves worsened the danger. Designed with tubes and rubber nipples, they were almost impossible to clean properly. Milk residue clung to the inside, turning each bottle into a breeding ground for bacteria. Even if the milk had been fresh at the start of the day, by evening it was contaminated. Reformers documented shocking scenes of bottles covered in mold, reused day after day without proper washing. Mothers did not understand the risk. They saw only a convenient way to feed their child while they worked or rested. The invisibility of bacteria made the danger abstract, while the convenience of the bottle made it irresistible. There's a cruel irony in how society framed the problem. When infant deaths mounted, blame often fell not on the milk, but on the mothers themselves. They were accused of negligence, of weaning too early, of being careless. Rarely did critics point to the contaminated supply chain or the lack of safe alternatives. In truth, mothers were trapped. They either starved their babies while working or fed them what was available. Milk was supposed to bridge the gap between mother and child, but instead it often dug a grave between them. The grief of burying an infant under such circumstances was compounded by guilt, even though the mother had little control over the circumstances. Some reformers tried to intervene. Charities established milk depots where poor families could access cleaner, boiled milk. Doctors began to campaign against the use of rubber tube bottles, urging simpler designs that could be washed more easily. Public health advocates spread pamphlets showing mothers how to boil milk before feeding it to infants. But adoption was slow, partly because of cost, partly because of tradition, and partly because many mothers had no time to follow such instructions. Poverty left little room for extra steps. Survival was measured in pennies and hours, not in scientific advice. The role of class in this tragedy cannot be overstated. Wealthy families also weaned babies early, but they had access to private dairies, cleaner milk, and wet nurses who reduced the risks. Poor families, crammed into tenements, had no such luxuries. They bought the cheapest milk from the dirtiest vendors and fed it through bottles impossible to clean in cramped, water-scarce living conditions. Thus, the very babies most in need of strong protection were the ones most exposed to contaminated milk. Infant mortality became not only a medical issue, but a brutal marker of inequality. And yet, despite the risks, milk retained its aura of necessity. Mothers continued to believe it was the best alternative to breast milk because every cultural, medical, and religious voice around them reinforced that belief. Reformers could shout, but traditions whispered louder. A white liquid in a bottle symbolized care, even if it carried death. That symbolic weight was nearly impossible to challenge. People trusted what they could see, and what they saw was whiteness and innocence. What they could not see, the bacteria multiplying by the millions, remained beyond imagination. One cannot help but reflect on the cruel rhythm of these households. A baby drinks milk in the morning, seems fine, but by afternoon begins to fuss. By night, the child is writhing with cramps, feverish, dehydrated. The mother rocks the baby, whispers prayers, perhaps boils more milk in desperation, believing warmth will soothe what cold milk failed to do. Sometimes the child recovers, sometimes not. The randomness of survival created a strange psychology. Milk was both feared and trusted, cursed and blessed, a daily gamble too important to abandon. The milk question, as reformers called it, became central to public health debates precisely because of infants. Children's deaths carried moral weight in a way adult sickness often did not. The image of a mother feeding her baby poisoned milk while believing she was saving it was too powerful to ignore. It forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about food safety, poverty, and responsibility. Milk was no longer just an economic product. It became a symbol of how society failed its most vulnerable. But as these debates grew, another contradiction surfaced. Even when mothers did everything right, boiling the milk, cleaning the bottles, trusting reputable vendors, illness still struck. This pointed to a darker reality. The problem was not just in the home, but in the very cows themselves, animals diseased and mistreated, producing milk that carried death from the moment it was squeezed into a bucket. And that realization would drive reformers to look beyond kitchens and bottles, straight into the filthy barns where the story truly began. Step inside an urban dairy stable in the mid-19th century, and the first thing you notice is not the cows themselves, but the stench. The air is thick with ammonia from manure that hasn't been cleared in days. The animals are chained in narrow stalls, forced to stand in filth, their hides caked with mud and waste. Their eyes are dull, their ribs visible, their udders swollen with infection. These were not the healthy, grass-fed cows of a pastoral painting. They were industrial machines of survival, fed on refuse from breweries and distilleries, expected to produce milk until their bodies collapsed. And in every bucket drawn from their udders, disease flowed invisibly into the homes of unsuspecting families. One of the most insidious diseases was bovine tuberculosis. Entire herds carried it, coughing and wasting away. But as long as a cow could stand and give milk, it was kept alive. Farmers and vendors did not recognize the danger, or chose not to. Tuberculosis bacteria passed directly into the milk, and when consumed, especially by children, it caused scrofula, bone infections, and deadly respiratory illness. Reformers later estimated that thousands of human cases of tuberculosis were linked directly to dairy herds. Imagine the tragic irony. Families seeking to strengthen their children with milk were feeding them the very disease that would waste their bodies and end their lives. Another silent killer was brucellosis, sometimes called undulant fever. It spread through milk from infected cows, producing waves of fever, fatigue, and joint pain in humans. Victims suffered for years, often too weak to work, while the source of their suffering remained hidden in the jug they trusted daily. There were also outbreaks of diphtheria and typhoid tied to milk from diseased cows, though the connection was poorly understood at the time. For families, sickness seemed to appear from nowhere. The cow in the stable, after all, still stood and chewed and gave milk. How could something that looked alive and strong be the cause of so much death? The conditions of these animals only magnified the problem. Urban dairies, especially in places like New York during the swill milk era, fed cows the hot, sour mash left over from whiskey production. The mash was cheap, plentiful, and filling, but it was also nutritionally worthless. Cows fed this diet became skeletal, their teeth rotted, their milk thin and bluish. To disguise it, vendors mixed in additives, but no additive could erase the diseases that thrived in malnourished animals. Visitors to these dairies described cows so sick they could barely stand, milked while their bodies trembled, their swollen udders oozing pus along with milk. That pus, too, found its way into the buckets, unnoticed and unchallenged. It is difficult today to comprehend the sheer scale of this contamination. Imagine hundreds of cows crammed into filthy stables, each one shedding bacteria into its milk, the entire output sold daily to thousands of families. In effect, every city became a laboratory where disease was cultured and distributed, disguised as nourishment, and the most vulnerable, infants, the elderly, the sick, were always the first to pay the price. Reformers later described these dairies as death factories, and the phrase was not an exaggeration. What makes this history even more haunting is the resistance of producers. When reformers exposed the conditions of diseased cows, dairy owners argued that appearances did not matter. A cow could look sick, they claimed, and still give perfectly good milk. They dismissed calls for culling infected animals as economic suicide. Every cow represented investment, and killing diseased animals meant losing income, so they continued milking, continued selling, continued profiting, even as epidemics swept through the neighborhoods they supplied. It was profit placed above health, survival placed above honesty. The public, too, was slow to believe. The idea that milk could be dangerous clashed with its symbolic purity. Mothers still carried jugs home with pride, pouring the white liquid into cups with the confidence of care. Only when scandals broke, when entire districts fell ill at once, did suspicion fall on the cows themselves. Journalists published gruesome illustrations of diseased animals in dark stables, their milk cans labeled death. These images shocked readers, but even then, change came slowly. Tradition and necessity are powerful forces, and for many, the risk of disease was easier to accept than the thought of abandoning milk altogether. One of the most poignant details is how often diseased cows were milked until the very day they died. Farmers described animals collapsing mid-milking, their bodies hauled away while the bucket of milk remained behind, ready for sale. No one saw the contradiction in this. If the animal could still give milk, then the milk was considered usable. It reveals a chilling blindness. People valued the product more than the source, as if the cow's suffering could be separated from what flowed from its body. But milk is not separate from the cow. It is the cow. And when the cow is diseased, so too is the milk. This realization, once it sank in, sparked a revolution in veterinary medicine and public health. Laws were eventually passed requiring inspections of herds, culling of diseased animals, and regular testing for tuberculosis. But these reforms came only after decades of resistance, decades of children buried, decades of families torn apart. The diseased cow became a symbol of both negligence and awakening, a reminder that health begins not in the kitchen but in the stable. And yet, even with diseased cows exposed, a deeper challenge remained. Because the problem was not just in the animals or the vendors, it was in the entire chain of trust. Families still had to buy milk from strangers, still had to believe the liquid in their cup was safe, which led reformers to ask the next inevitable question. If the source could not be trusted and the supply chain was corrupt, what could be done to protect the consumer? The answer would emerge in the form of one of the most controversial solutions of the era: pasteurization. Imagine the world at the moment Louis Pasteur first demonstrated that heating wine and beer to a certain temperature could prevent spoilage. His discovery was revolutionary, but also simple. Invisible organisms caused fermentation and decay, and heat could kill them. It was only a matter of time before reformers applied this logic to milk. If heating could preserve wine and beer, why not protect the drink most consumed by children? Thus, the idea of pasteurization was born, not as a luxury, not as an experiment, but as a potential life-saving shield against the dangers that had plagued milk for centuries. At first glance, pasteurization seemed like a miracle. By heating milk to around 60-70 degrees Celsius and then cooling it quickly, bacteria could be destroyed without altering the basic structure of the liquid. Outbreaks of typhoid, tuberculosis, and diphtheria linked to milk dropped dramatically wherever the process was adopted. Hospitals and orphanages reported lower infant mortality rates when pasteurized milk was used. For reformers, the evidence was undeniable. Pasteurization was not just a scientific breakthrough, it was a moral imperative. To them, resisting it was equivalent to allowing children to die needlessly. And yet, resistance came swiftly and with passion. Farmers and vendors feared pasteurization because it threatened their business. To admit milk needed to be boiled was to admit it was unsafe, and to admit it was unsafe was to risk losing the trust of customers. Some argued that pasteurization would destroy the natural vitality of milk, stripping it of flavor and nutrients. Others claimed it was a trick by governments and reformers to control the dairy trade. Even among the public, many resisted, clinging to the belief that raw milk was purer and more authentic, even if it carried hidden dangers. There was a strange comedy in these objections. Imagine a mother refusing pasteurized milk for her child because she believed heat made it dead, all while watching that same child fall gravely ill from raw milk laced with bacteria. Or vendors boasting that their milk was untouched by fire, as if that were proof of superiority, not a death sentence in disguise. These reactions show how deeply humans trust tradition over evidence. Even when evidence could save lives, milk was more than food. It was culture, identity, and trust. And culture rarely surrenders to science without a fight. Pasteurization also faced practical barriers. Heating milk required equipment, fuel, and infrastructure, all of which cost money. Small dairies resisted because they could not afford the investment, while larger producers resisted because they feared regulation would cut into profits. For governments, enforcing pasteurization meant establishing inspection systems, testing facilities, and new laws, all difficult in societies already skeptical of state intervention. So even as science marched forward, practice lagged behind. Many families continued to buy raw milk simply because it was cheaper and more familiar. One of the most powerful forces pushing for pasteurization was public scandal. Newspapers began reporting stories of orphanages where children thrived on pasteurized milk while others died on raw. Reformers published statistics showing dramatic drops in disease when pasteurization was introduced. Illustrations appeared depicting raw milk as a skull and crossbones, while pasteurized milk was drawn as a guardian angel. These campaigns shocked the public into awareness, but they also provoked backlash. Dairy owners accused reformers of hysteria, insisting that cleanliness at the farm was enough. The debate turned milk into a battlefield between science and tradition, progress and resistance. In many ways, pasteurization was not only about milk, it was about the role of science in daily life. Could invisible microbes really dictate the rules of survival? Could ordinary people trust processes they could not see or understand? Pasteurization required faith in science, a new kind of trust that replaced blind belief in purity with rational acceptance of evidence. But faith in science does not come easily. It required education, advocacy, and sometimes tragedy to break through. Every epidemic linked to raw milk, every child buried after preventable illness, became another argument reformers used to sway the public. Eventually, cities began to adopt pasteurization more widely, often starting with milk supplied to hospitals and schools. Slowly, resistance eroded as the benefits became undeniable. Infant mortality dropped, epidemics shrank, and milk regained some of the trust it had lost. Yet even then, a core of resistance remained. To this day, debates about raw versus pasteurized milk continue, echoing the same arguments of the 19th century. It shows that the battle was never just about microbes, it was about identity, trust, and the human struggle to reconcile tradition with innovation. The emergence of pasteurization was thus a turning point, not just for milk, but for society. It marked the beginning of modern food safety, the idea that science and law could intervene to protect the public from hidden dangers. But it also revealed how fragile progress can be. how every step forward meets resistance from those unwilling to abandon the comfort of old ways. Pasteurization did not just kill bacteria, it killed illusions, forcing people to see milk not as inherently pure, but as something that required protection. And yet, even as pasteurization spread, another obstacle appeared: inequality. Clean, pasteurized milk was often more expensive, available mainly to the wealthy or to institutions. The poor, as always, were left with the cheapest, riskiest versions, buying raw milk from street vendors because it was all they could afford. Which leads us to the next unsettling truth. Progress alone is not enough if it is not shared. And the story of milk would soon reveal how the struggle for safety became entangled with the struggle for equality. Picture two households in the same city around 1890. In the first, a wealthy family in a spacious townhouse pours glass after glass of clean, pasteurized milk delivered in sealed bottles from a trusted dairy. Their children drink without fear, their health guarded by both science and privilege. In the second, just a few blocks away in a cramped tenement, a poor family buys a tin cup of milk from a street vendor. It has been carried in an open pail, watered down to stretch profits, and sits warm from the day's sun. The children drink it eagerly because there's nothing else to offer, and by evening, one is writhing with cramps while the mother desperately searches for remedies she cannot afford. This contrast captures the cruel inequality that defined access to safe milk. The wealthy could buy protection, the poor could not. The problem was not simply about technology. Pasteurization existed, sanitary dairies existed, and bottled milk was available. But these came at a higher price, a price many working-class families could never pay. Clean milk required investment in equipment, in transportation, in inspections, and all of that translated into cost. For middle and upper-class families, the extra pennies per quart were manageable. For poor families living on the edge of starvation, those pennies were the difference between buying milk or buying bread. And so, while reforms promised safety, they delivered it unevenly, leaving the most vulnerable behind. Charities attempted to bridge this gap. In cities like New York, milk depots were established where poor mothers could purchase boiled or pasteurized milk at reduced prices, sometimes even for free. Reformers celebrated these initiatives, and indeed, they saved lives. Infant mortality dropped in neighborhoods with milk depots, proving the power of safe milk. But the reach of these programs was limited. Not every family could travel to the depot, not every city had one, and not every mother had the time to stand in line after long shifts in factories. The inequality remained, stark and unforgiving. One of the cruelest ironies was that the poor, who needed protection the most, were the ones forced to consume the riskiest milk. Wealthy families often kept their own cows in the countryside or contracted directly with reputable dairies. Some even had private delivery systems with bottles sealed to prevent tampering. Meanwhile, the poor relied on street vendors who bought the cheapest milk available, sometimes from diseased cows, often diluted, and always vulnerable to contamination. The result was a predictable cycle. The poor grew sick, reformers shouted for change, but the structural divide ensured that clean milk flowed only into certain homes. Statistics from the late 19th century paint the picture with brutal clarity. In New York, infant mortality rates in wealthy districts were significantly lower than in poor neighborhoods, and the difference was traced directly to milk supplies. In London, families who could afford bottled milk saw far fewer cases of typhoid or summer complaint, while those in East End tenements buried child after child. Reformers began to describe milk as not just food, but a measure of inequality itself, a white liquid that revealed who lived and who died. The injustice becomes even more striking when we consider how public perception was shaped. Advertisements for bottled milk boasted of purity, cleanliness, and safety, using imagery of golden-haired children drinking from sparkling glasses. These ads targeted the wealthy, reinforcing the idea that health was a product one could buy. For the poor, there was no such reassurance. Their milk came unbranded, unsealed, and unprotected, its dangers hidden behind the very color that symbolized innocence. Milk became both a symbol of aspiration and a reminder of exclusion, a drink that revealed social class with every sip. There's a bitter comedy in how society justified this divide. Some argued that poor families did not need pasteurized milk, that they would not appreciate the difference, or that providing it at low cost would encourage dependency. Others claimed it was impossible to regulate every street vendor, so the poor would simply have to adapt. In reality, these arguments masked a deeper truth. The lives of poor children were valued less. Reformers knew it, mothers felt it, and the graveyards testified to it. And yet, inequality also fueled the momentum for broader reform. The sight of endless child funerals in poor districts, the statistics showing sharp divides in mortality, and the moral outrage of activists forced governments to act. Safe milk began to be framed not as a luxury but as a right, something that should be available to all regardless of income. Public health campaigns grew louder, arguing that no society could call itself civilized while allowing children to die from something so preventable. In many ways, milk became the front line in the birth of the idea of social responsibility. Still, progress was uneven. Even as pasteurization laws spread, enforcement was weakest in poor neighborhoods. Even as bottled milk became common, the cheapest, riskiest versions still circulated in tenements. Mothers continued to face impossible choices, spend scarce coins on safer milk and sacrifice other necessities, or gamble with cheaper milk and risk their child's health. It was a choice no one should have had to make, but it was the daily reality of millions. And that reality posed the next deeper question. If society could not guarantee equal access to something as basic as safe milk, what did that mean for food safety more broadly? Because milk was not the only product contaminated, adulterated, or priced beyond reach. It was simply the most visible. The struggle for safe milk became a mirror reflecting the larger struggle for justice, forcing people to ask whether health was a privilege or a universal right. And that question would not stop at milk. It would spill into bread, meat, water, and beyond, shaping the entire future of public health. Imagine walking into a hospital ward for children in the late 19th century. Rows of small iron beds line the room, each one occupied by a frail child. Some are crying weakly, others lie motionless, their mothers seated beside them with expressions of helplessness carved into their faces. The doctors move quickly, but their treatments are limited. Too many of these children have been brought here after drinking contaminated milk, their bodies dehydrated from diarrhea, their fevers raging. In the midst of this despair, reformers and physicians proposed a radical idea. If families could not access safe milk on the streets, why not create centralized pure milk depots where mothers could obtain milk guaranteed to be clean, boiled, or pasteurized? It was a revolutionary thought, and it changed the course of public health. The first milk depots appeared in European cities, with Paris being among the pioneers. In 1892, the French physician Dr. Jacques Pasteur, no relation to Louis Pasteur, opened a facility where poor mothers could purchase sterilized milk at a low price. The concept spread quickly. New York soon followed with its own depots, championed by reformers like Nathan Strauss, a wealthy philanthropist horrified by the staggering infant mortality rates among poor families. Strauss funded milk stations across the city, offering pasteurized milk at just 1 cent per cup, sometimes even free for those who could not afford it. The results were dramatic. Neighborhoods with milk depots saw sharp declines in child deaths, proving beyond doubt that safe milk could save lives. The depots were more than just distribution points. They were symbols of a new philosophy. For the first time, society recognized that health was not only an individual responsibility, but a collective one. The very existence of pure milk depots declared that children had a right to safe nourishment, regardless of family income. This was not charity alone. It was an early form of social justice, a bridge between philanthropy and public health policy. And for mothers who had buried child after child, it was nothing short of a miracle. The logistics were carefully managed. Milk was sourced from healthier herds, transported under supervision, boiled or pasteurized in controlled environments, and distributed in sealed bottles. Mothers were instructed on how to handle it, how to keep it cool, and how to use clean bottles to avoid recontamination. For many women, these instructions were the first time they had received direct education about food safety. Reformers realized that depots could do more than save lives. They could reshape habits, creating a ripple effect of knowledge across entire communities. Of course, the depots were not without critics. Some vendors saw them as threats to their livelihood, accusing reformers of ruining the traditional milk trade. Others argued that pasteurized milk was unnatural, and that families should rely on raw milk from honest cows. There were even political battles, with some accusing philanthropists like Nathan Strauss of meddling in government affairs or seeking fame. But the evidence was undeniable. In districts where depots operated, infant mortality rates plummeted. The contrast was too stark for critics to dismiss. There's a fascinating irony here. Hospitals, which had long been seen as places of last resort, became the pioneers of prevention. Instead of only treating children after they fell ill, they began protecting them before sickness struck. Pure milk depots inside or near hospitals symbolized this shift. They were both practical and symbolic, bridges between suffering and survival, between tradition and modern science. The sight of mothers lining up outside milk stations became a daily ritual in many cities, a quiet revolution unfolding in plain view. The impact went beyond immediate survival. Children who grew up drinking safe milk from depots were healthier, stronger, and more likely to reach adulthood. This ripple effect changed demographics, contributing to population growth and better labor force stability. In a way, milk depots were not just saving children, they were shaping the future of nations. Reformers used this argument to push governments to expand the programs, insisting that healthier children meant stronger societies. It was both a humanitarian plea and a pragmatic calculation, and it worked. One particularly striking example comes from New York in the early 20th century. In neighborhoods served by Strauss's depots, the infant mortality rate dropped by more than 20% within just a few years. Newspapers published heart-wrenching stories of mothers who credited the depots with saving their babies. These stories turned milk into a symbol of hope, a white liquid no longer associated only with betrayal but with rescue. For the first time in decades, milk began to regain its lost reputation. though only in its purified form. But these depots also raised an uncomfortable truth. If milk could be made safe in controlled environments, why was unsafe milk still allowed to circulate at all? Reformers argued that milk depots were only a temporary solution, a stopgap until governments enforced pasteurization across the entire supply. Yet governments were slow, and the inequality persisted. Safe milk was available, but often only in neighborhoods lucky enough to have a depot, or only to mothers who could take the time to fetch it. The question loomed, should survival depend on charity, or should it be guaranteed by law? This debate pushed society toward the next great transformation. Pure milk depots had shown what was possible, but they also exposed the inadequacy of piecemeal solutions. They were proof of concept, but not the final answer. Because if milk could only be trusted when distributed by charities and hospitals, what did that say about the entire food system? And that realization drove reformers to demand broader change, a shift from local depots to national standards. The fight for milk safety was no longer about isolated neighborhoods. It was about reshaping the very foundation of how societies thought about food, trust, and health. By the end of the 19th century, the story of milk had already shaken cities to their core. Journalists had exposed swill milk scandals, reformers had founded depots to distribute safer supplies, and scientists had proven that heat could kill invisible killers. But all of these were local, fragile, and inconsistent. In one neighborhood, a mother could find clean, pasteurized milk. In the next, her neighbor's child might be fed liquid laced with chalk, sewage, or tuberculosis. It became increasingly clear that piecemeal solutions were not enough. If milk was to stop being both medicine and poison, society needed rules that applied everywhere, not just where reformers shouted loudest. Thus began the fight for national milk standards, a struggle that revealed as much about politics and power as it did about food. The push for standards was born from outrage. Reformers pointed to the statistics that haunted every city: soaring infant mortality, recurring outbreaks of typhoid and tuberculosis, and graveyards filled with the victims of tainted milk. And they argued that milk was too important to be left to chance. Unlike beer or wine, which adults could choose to drink or not, milk was given to children, to the sick, to the elderly. It was not just another commodity, it was a necessity of life. And because of that, reformers insisted, the state had a moral obligation to protect it. But the path forward was not simple. Farmers resisted, fearing that inspections and regulations would expose the poor conditions of their herds. Vendors resisted, warning that higher standards would drive up costs and put them out of business. Even ordinary citizens resisted, clinging to the idea that government intervention in food was a dangerous intrusion into private life. The debate over milk became a microcosm of a larger question. How far should the state go in regulating the essentials of daily living? The early attempts at national standards revealed this tension. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was one of the first federal laws to regulate milk, requiring honest labeling and giving authorities the power to act against adulteration. In Britain, similar reforms demanded inspections of dairies and established minimum fat content for milk to prevent watering down. These laws were groundbreaking, but enforcement was patchy. Inspectors were few, and bribery was common. Reformers soon realized that laws on paper were meaningless unless backed by resources, enforcement, and cultural change. One fascinating detail is how the fight for milk standards intersected with class politics. Wealthier citizens often supported reforms because they could afford higher prices for cleaner milk. Poor families, on the other hand, feared that stricter standards would make milk completely unaffordable. Reformers found themselves in a paradox. To protect the poor, they needed to regulate milk, but by regulating milk, they risked pricing the poor out of the market. This tension fueled endless debates in newspapers and parliaments. Was it better to have cheap, dirty milk that at least filled stomachs, or expensive, clean milk that fewer could buy? The question had no easy answer, and the poor were left balancing survival against safety. Scandals continued to drive change. Each new outbreak of typhoid or tuberculosis traced back to milk became ammunition for reformers. Graphic newspaper illustrations, skulls drawn into milk bottles, skeletons sitting at breakfast tables, stoked public fear. The fight for national milk standards was fought as much in the press as in Parliament. Reformers learned to wield shock and outrage as tools, knowing that no mother could ignore a headline that linked milk to death in the nursery. Public opinion slowly shifted, and politicians, always sensitive to outrage, began to take notice. Even then, the standards that emerged were often compromises. Farmers were required to maintain minimal hygiene, but inspections were infrequent. Pasteurization was encouraged in some regions, but not mandated everywhere. Minimum fat content laws helped prevent fraud, but did little to address contamination. The progress was real, but it was also fragile, uneven, and riddled with loopholes. Reformers celebrated victories, but epidemics reminded everyone how much work remained. The irony is that while milk became one of the first foods subject to national regulation, it also became a symbol of the limits of regulation. You could pass laws, but you could not instantly change habits, traditions, or economic realities. Families still bought from vendors they trusted, even if their milk was unsafe. farmers still resisted improvements they could not afford. Inspectors could be bribed, reports could be ignored, and the chain of contamination remained stubbornly resilient. National standards were a step, but they were not a cure. And yet, the very existence of national milk standards marked a turning point in the history of food. For the first time, societies recognized that the safety of what people ate and drank could not be left entirely to individuals. Milk forced governments to step into kitchens, into barns, and into markets, reshaping the relationship between citizens and the state. It was a recognition that survival was not only personal but collective, and that trust in food required more than tradition. It required oversight. Still, one problem loomed large. Even with national standards, milk had to travel long distances from cow to cup, passing through countless hands along the way. Standards could reduce fraud and contamination, but they could not solve the fundamental issue of distance. The longer milk traveled, the more it spoiled, the greater the chance of tampering. Which is why the next chapter in this story shifted the battlefield from regulation to innovation, from laws to logistics. Because to truly save milk, reformers realized they needed not just rules but technology, specifically refrigeration. Close your eyes and imagine a hot summer morning in 1880. A milk wagon rattles through cobblestone streets, its cans sloshing under the relentless sun. By the time the vendor reaches the last household, the milk is warm, sour, and on the verge of curdling. Mothers still buy it because there is no alternative. They rush it into porridge or tea before it turns completely, praying their children's stomachs can handle it. This was daily life before refrigeration. Milk existed in a race against time, and more often than not, time won. Refrigeration changed everything. At first, it came in the form of natural ice. In northern climates, massive blocks were cut from frozen lakes in winter, stored in insulated ice houses, and delivered to cities by wagon or train. Families placed these blocks into ice boxes, wooden chests lined with metal, to keep food cool. For the first time, milk could last more than a few hours, but this solution was imperfect. Ice harvested from lakes was often contaminated with sewage or industrial runoff, and as it melted, the water sometimes leaked into milk containers. The irony was cruel. The very ice meant to preserve milk could introduce new dangers. The true revolution came with mechanical refrigeration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Factories, breweries, and eventually dairies installed machines that could produce cold air artificially, independent of the seasons. Suddenly, milk could be cooled immediately after milking and kept at low temperatures throughout transport and storage. This cold chain, as we would call it today, was transformative. Milk that once spoiled in hours could now last days, sometimes even a week. The clock was no longer the enemy. For the first time, safety was not just a gamble, it was a system. The impact on cities was dramatic. Before refrigeration, dairies near urban centers operated under appalling conditions because milk had to be produced close to where it was consumed. Cows were kept in stables behind breweries, factories, and tenements, often in filth, because proximity was more important than quality. With refrigeration, milk could travel long distances without spoiling. This allowed healthier cows on rural farms to supply urban populations. It was a quiet but profound shift. Refrigeration didn't just preserve milk, it reshaped the geography of food, moving production from dirty cities back to cleaner countryside pastures. There is a striking irony here. For centuries, people had associated freshness with proximity. The closer the cow, the safer the milk. But refrigeration inverted that logic. The farther away the cow, the cleaner the milk, because the countryside offered better conditions, and refrigeration preserved it during the journey. Trust was no longer about seeing the cow yourself. It was about trusting technology to keep danger at bay. This was unsettling for many families, but the results were undeniable. Refrigerated milk reduced spoilage, reduced outbreaks, and slowly restored milk's reputation. Yet refrigeration also revealed inequalities. Wealthy families adopted iceboxes first, while poor households often relied on traditional storage methods, leaving them vulnerable. Even when mechanical refrigeration reached dairies and distributors, not every home had the equipment to store milk safely. For the working poor, milk still spoiled quickly, forcing them to buy in small quantities daily, often from less reputable vendors. The divide between those with access to refrigeration and those without mirrored the broader inequalities of the age. Milk was safer, but not equally safe for everyone. The cultural impact of refrigeration is fascinating. Before it, recipes emphasized speed, using milk quickly, disguising sourness in puddings or fermenting it into clabber. With refrigeration, recipes began to assume milk could be stored for days. The rhythm of kitchens changed, and so did trust. Housewives no longer had to sniff and taste nervously each morning. They began to rely on the machine humming quietly in the corner. Refrigeration, in this sense, was not just a technological shift, it was a psychological one. It gave families a sense of control over a liquid that had long dictated its own unpredictable terms. But the story of refrigeration was not only about homes, it was about logistics. Refrigerated train cars and later trucks extended the reach of rural dairies to urban consumers. Entire supply chains were reorganized around cold storage. Dairies invested in cooling tanks, warehouses built vast cold rooms, and distribution systems evolved to keep milk cold from cow to consumer. This infrastructure, what we now call the cold chain, was revolutionary. It did not just improve milk safety, it created the very idea of modern food distribution. Still, refrigeration was not a magic cure. If milk was contaminated at the source, from diseased cows or dirty equipment, cold temperatures could slow bacterial growth but not eliminate it. In fact, refrigeration sometimes created a false sense of security. Families believed their milk was safe simply because it was cold, not realizing that dangerous bacteria like tuberculosis or brucellosis could survive chilling. Reformers warned that refrigeration and pasteurization had to work together. One slowed spoilage, the other killed microbes. But convincing the public of this nuance was difficult. For many, cold meant clean, and that illusion persisted stubbornly. There's an almost comical element in the advertising of the time. Companies boasted about frost-kissed milk or nature preserved by cold, selling refrigeration as if it were a miracle cure. Pictures showed happy children drinking milk beside blocks of shining ice, their cheeks rosy with health. The message was simple: cold equals purity. These campaigns reassured the public but also distracted from the real truth, that refrigeration alone was not enough. It bought time, but it did not erase contamination. And yet, refrigeration did something more profound than reformers expected. It shifted the balance of power. Once milk could be refrigerated, consumers began to demand it. Vendors who sold unrefrigerated milk lost customers. Farmers who invested in cooling equipment gained reputation. Slowly, refrigeration went from being a luxury to an expectation. It was no longer an add-on, but a baseline of trust. That cultural shift was as important as the technological one, because it forced producers to modernize or risk being abandoned. But the question lingered: if refrigeration and pasteurization together could make milk safe, why did outbreaks still happen? Why did children still fall ill, even in cities with modern cold chains? The answer lay not in technology alone, but in the system itself. Inconsistencies in enforcement, corruption, and the gaps between rich and poor. And that realization pushed reformers to a final radical idea. Milk could not just be a commodity sold by anyone, it had to be a regulated, standardized product under the watch of law. The fight for universal milk safety was not yet over. In fact, it was about to enter its fiercest stage. Picture the morning ritual of a family around 1905. The father opens the door to find not a vendor ladling milk from a dented tin pail, but a delivery boy placing a glass bottle on the stoop. The bottle is capped, sealed with paper or foil, and the milk inside looks untouched, protected. The mother picks it up, feeling a small thrill of reassurance. She cannot see bacteria, she cannot inspect the farm, but she can see the seal. That thin cover becomes a symbol of safety, an unbroken promise that the milk has not been tampered with. Bottled milk did more than hold liquid. It carried trust. Until bottled milk became common, the act of buying milk was always uncertain. A housewife had to judge with her senses. Did it look white enough? Did it smell fresh? Was the vendor honest? Every purchase was a gamble, and often the gamble failed. Bottling transformed that relationship. By standardizing the package, it suggested uniformity and purity. A bottle implied that someone, somewhere, had taken responsibility. And for a society battered by decades of scandals, epidemics, and infant deaths, that implication was powerful. The innovation of bottling did not come easily. Early bottles were expensive, heavy, and fragile. They had to be cleaned, sterilized, and reused, which required infrastructure many dairies lacked. At first, only wealthier families received bottled deliveries, while the poor continued to buy from open pails on street corners. But as refrigeration and pasteurization spread, bottling became the logical next step. It was the visible sign of invisible progress. Reformers championed it, arguing that no amount of boiling or chilling could match the psychological comfort of a sealed container. What's fascinating is how quickly bottled milk changed consumer behavior. Housewives began refusing milk from open cans, demanding bottles instead. Newspapers printed editorials praising the cleanliness of sealed bottles. Advertisements showed healthy children drinking from clear glasses, with the bottle proudly displayed in the background. The message was clear. Modern mothers chose bottled milk, while careless ones clung to the past. Trust was no longer just about the product. It was about identity, about being part of a modern, responsible society. But, as always, the story carried irony. Bottled milk could still be contaminated. If the cow was diseased, if the equipment was dirty, if the pasteurization process was skipped, the milk in the bottle was no safer than that in the open pail. The seal did not kill bacteria, it only prevented tampering after bottling. And yet, consumers believed in it with near religious faith. The bottle became a talisman, a symbol that soothed fears even when the danger remained. Trust, once shattered by scandal, was rebuilt not entirely on science, but on perception. Reformers understood this duality. They embraced bottling not only because it improved sanitation, but because it changed psychology. People were more likely to boil milk, refrigerate it properly, and handle it with care if it came in a container that looked professional. The act of breaking the seal reminded families that milk was not just another liquid. It was something fragile that demanded respect. In this way, the bottle educated as much as it protected. It turned every kitchen into a small laboratory of awareness. Bottling also reshaped the economy of milk. Large dairies with the resources to bottle gained dominance, while smaller vendors without equipment were pushed aside. The milk industry began to consolidate, moving away from informal street sales toward centralized systems of production and distribution. Bottled milk was not just a technological change, it was a structural one. It professionalized the trade, driving out the ragged milkmen with open buckets and replacing them with branded companies that could advertise trust. In this sense, the bottle was both a shield and a sword, protecting consumers while cutting down competitors. There's a curious human detail in how families reused bottles. Children often carried them back to dairies for a few pennies refund, and in poor neighborhoods, collecting bottles became a small but important source of income. Housewives rinsed bottles obsessively, even when they didn't trust other forms of sanitation. The bottle, once emptied, became part of the household rhythm, its presence a daily reminder of both nourishment and fragility. Over time, the clink of bottles on doorsteps became a cultural soundtrack to city mornings, a sound that symbolized not just milk but modern life itself. Still, reformers worried. They knew that public trust in bottled milk could easily become complacency. People who believed the seal guaranteed safety might neglect boiling, refrigeration, or scrutiny. They might overlook that poor families still lacked access to bottles, relying instead on cheaper, riskier milk. The bottle was progress, but it was not perfection. It was a step, and like every step in the history of milk, it carried both salvation and illusion. Yet perhaps illusion was necessary. After decades of betrayal, families needed something visible to restore faith. The bottle offered that. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Progress that changed the rhythm of households, the structure of the dairy industry, and the expectations of consumers. And once expectations rose, there was no going back. Housewives, who had once tolerated flies in open pails, now demanded sealed bottles. Children who had once drunk sour milk without complaint grew up expecting fresh, cold milk every day. The culture had shifted, and with it, the future of milk safety. But even as bottled milk reshaped trust, reformers began to see a larger picture. Bottles and seals could restore confidence, but they could not solve everything. Safe milk required more than clean containers. It required clean herds, regulated farms, and laws that applied to everyone equally. Which raised the next inevitable question. If trust could be manufactured through glass and foil, how could it be enforced through law and science so that every bottle truly lived up to its promise? By the turn of the 20th century, milk was no longer just a household concern. It had become a political one. No other food had stirred so much scandal, heartbreak, and debate. Meat could be salted, bread could be baked hard, beer could be boiled, but milk was consumed raw, fresh and daily, often by children too weak to survive mistakes. Every epidemic, every grave filled with infants, added to the sense that milk was not just another commodity, but a test of whether society could protect its people. And so milk, more than any other food, became the catalyst for some of the earliest food safety laws. The push began with outrage. Reformers published statistics that stunned the public. In some cities, half of infant deaths were tied directly to milk. Journalists exposed diseased cows, filthy dairies, and vendors stirring chalk and plaster into buckets. Illustrations of babies drinking from bottles marked with skulls and crossbones appeared in newspapers. These images shocked society into asking a radical question. Should the government step in to regulate what people ate and drank? In an era when many believed in laissez-faire economics and minimal state intervention, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The first food safety laws often targeted milk specifically. In Britain, the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, and later the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, were largely driven by scandals over watered, chalked, and contaminated milk. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 gave federal authorities the power to act against adulterated milk, making it one of the earliest foods explicitly named in regulatory texts. These laws were not perfect, but they established a principle that was groundbreaking. The state had a duty to protect citizens from hidden dangers in food. It's worth noting how unusual this was. For centuries, governments had intervened in trade to prevent shortages or control prices, but rarely to guarantee safety. If bread was moldy, you simply bought better bread next time. If meat was rancid, you blamed the butcher, not the state. But milk was different. It struck too close to home, harmed too many children, and spread disease too invisibly to be left to chance. Milk forced lawmakers to rethink the boundaries of responsibility. Suddenly, what happened in barns, dairies, and vendor carts was no longer just private business. It was public health. Of course, resistance was fierce. Farmers argued that inspections would ruin them. Vendors insisted that fraud was exaggerated. Politicians warned that regulation would drive up costs and make milk unaffordable for the poor, and ordinary citizens sometimes balked at the idea of government meddling in their kitchens. But the mounting evidence of death was too heavy to ignore. Reformers cleverly framed the debate not as economics, but as morality. Was it right, they asked, to allow children to die simply because milk was sold in secrecy and filth? Was profit worth more than life? By shifting the question, they forced lawmakers into action. One fascinating example of milk's influence is found in New York City. After decades of swill milk scandals, the city created some of the first municipal boards of health with real power to inspect dairies, test milk, and shut down unsafe vendors. These boards became prototypes for modern health departments. What began with milk inspections expanded into meat markets, bakeries, and eventually restaurants. In other words, the very concept of health inspections, so ordinary to us today, was born out of milk's betrayal. The white liquid that had once symbolized purity became the unlikely architect of public oversight. Milk also shaped how science entered law. For the first time, chemical tests were used in courts to prove fraud. Drops of iodine revealed starch, chemical titrations revealed chalk, and later bacterial counts revealed contamination. Judges who once relied on eyewitness testimony now listened to scientists. This marriage of science and law was a turning point. Food safety was no longer about what could be seen or smelled. It was about what could be measured. And milk, with its invisible dangers, forced that leap into modernity. But progress was uneven. In many rural areas, milk continued to be sold raw and unregulated, and outbreaks continued. Inspectors were often underfunded, bribery was rampant, and enforcement varied wildly from city to city. The existence of laws did not guarantee their effectiveness. Yet even flawed, these laws created expectations. Families began to demand that milk be tested, sealed, certified. Vendors who could not provide proof of safety lost customers. Over time, this consumer pressure combined with legal pressure to transform the industry. There is an almost comic irony in how milk, once marketed as the purest of foods, became the very reason people demanded laws to guarantee purity. It was as if the betrayal had cut so deep that only regulation could restore faith. Mothers who once judged milk by sight now looked for official stamps of approval. Households that once trusted vendors now trusted inspectors. The state, reluctantly at first, became the new guarantor of safety. And once that trust shifted, it did not stop at milk. Bread, meat, canned goods, all fell under the shadow of regulation sparked by the crisis of milk. This transformation reveals something profound about society. Progress often comes not from abstract ideals, but from practical betrayals. People tolerated unsafe water, questionable bread, even rotten meat for centuries. But when milk, food for babies, turned deadly, tolerance snapped. The line between private trade and public responsibility was redrawn. Milk was the wedge that opened the door to modern food law. Yet, as with every stage in this story, victory was partial. Laws could be written, inspectors hired, and stamps affixed. But milk was still vulnerable to mishandling, inequality, and corruption. Families still died from contaminated milk long after standards were introduced. Which leads us to the next critical question. If laws alone could not guarantee safety, what else was needed? Reformers realized that beyond rules and inspections, they needed education, teaching families themselves how to handle milk safely at home, from boiling to storing. And that realization would ignite a new wave of campaigns aimed not just at producers and vendors, but at mothers and kitchens. Imagine a crowded tenement kitchen in 1910. The room is dim, the air heavy with the smell of coal smoke, damp laundry, and frying onions. A mother bends over a small stove, her infant crying behind her in a cradle. On the table sits a pamphlet handed to her earlier by a nurse from the city's health department. Its bold letters declare, "Boil all milk before giving to your baby." She squints at it, lips moving slowly as she deciphers the words. For the first time, instead of relying on vendors' promises or luck, she is being told that she herself has the power to make milk safer. This moment, multiplied across thousands of homes, was the beginning of a revolution, not only in food, but in culture, the rise of public health education. Before these campaigns, mothers often relied on tradition or hearsay. Some believed boiling milk destroyed its goodness. Others thought adding sugar, alcohol, or spices could strengthen weak milk. Many simply trusted what they could see and smell, assuming that whiteness meant purity. But reformers, armed with science and statistics, began to challenge these beliefs. They understood that laws and inspections could only go so far. Milk passed through too many hands, too many streets, too many kitchens. To truly protect children, knowledge had to reach the very people pouring it into bottles and cups every day. Public health officials launched campaigns that today seem both quaint and profound. Posters were hung in marketplaces and hospitals. Boil the milk, save the baby. Pamphlets were distributed with step-by-step illustrations. Show the milk in a pot, show the bubbles, show the cooled liquid being poured into a clean glass. Nurses visited homes to demonstrate, sometimes boiling milk in front of mothers. repeating the mantra that heat was the invisible shield against invisible killers. Reformers spoke in churches, schools, and women's clubs, turning milk safety into a moral duty as well as a practical habit. These campaigns combined fear and hope. Fear because they reminded mothers of the staggering infant mortality rates that haunted poor neighborhoods. Hope because they suggested that even without money or political power, a mother could protect her child by simply applying knowledge. The tone was often dramatic. Pamphlets declared that every glass of raw milk is a roll of the dice with death, while also promising boiled milk means strong children. The mix of urgency and empowerment proved effective. Slowly, boiling milk became less a superstition and more a standard practice in working-class homes. There's a dark humor in how reformers sometimes had to sell boiling milk like a product. In New York, one campaign compared it to polishing shoes. If you would not send your husband to work in dirty boots, why send your baby to life with dirty milk? In Chicago, reformers organized public demonstrations where large kettles of milk were boiled in parks, drawing curious crowds. Children were handed glasses of cooled, boiled milk with slogans like, "Clean milk, strong nation." These events blurred the line between education and theater, but they worked. The message spread. And yet, resistance persisted. Some mothers insisted that boiled milk tasted flat, that children disliked it. Others clung to cultural beliefs that raw milk was more natural. Poverty itself created barriers. Boiling milk required fuel, time, and clean containers, luxuries many tenement families lacked. Reformers knew this and tried to adapt, sometimes providing fuel vouchers or lending out sterilized bottles through milk depots. But the gap between knowledge and practice remained wide, a reminder that education could only succeed when supported by real resources. Still, the results were striking. Cities that implemented widespread education campaigns saw noticeable drops in infant mortality. New York's health department proudly reported that in districts where nurses visited homes to teach boiling, child deaths fell by nearly a third. These statistics were brandished in newspapers as proof that knowledge could save lives as effectively as laws. Reformers argued that education was not just charity, but a form of empowerment, giving mothers the tools to fight back against dangers that governments and vendors had failed to eliminate. The cultural ripple effects of these campaigns are fascinating. For the first time, mothers began to see themselves as active participants in public health. Their kitchens became battlefields in the war against disease. Their pots and stoves transformed into weapons of defense. This shift gave women a new kind of authority, linking maternal care to civic responsibility. Reformers often leaned into this, portraying mothers as guardians of the nation's future, their duty extending beyond the household to society itself. Milk safety became a story not just of science, but of gender, class, and power. But education campaigns also revealed their limits. Even when mothers boiled milk, it could still be recontaminated in dirty bottles, handled with unwashed hands, or stored without refrigeration. Reformers soon realized that while education was powerful, it could not solve structural problems. You could tell a mother to boil milk, but if she was buying it from diseased cows or corrupt vendors, the danger never truly disappeared. Knowledge was essential, but it was not enough, and this realization pointed reformers toward the next step. If true safety could not be achieved solely through personal responsibility, then the burden had to be shared by the system itself. Education could save many, but to save all, governments and dairies would need to guarantee that milk was clean before it ever reached the home. And so the focus began to shift from kitchens and pamphlets back to farms, factories, and the idea of creating a completely standardized, trustworthy supply chain. Because only when the source was secure could the family pot truly fulfill its promise of protection. By the early 20th century, milk had been transformed from a simple household staple into a political, medical, and moral battlefield. Reformers had fought for pasteurization, philanthropists had founded milk depots, and public health officials had blanketed cities with education campaigns urging mothers to boil milk at home. Yet even with these efforts, a haunting question lingered. How could families trust that the milk they bought was truly safe from the very beginning before it ever reached their kitchens? Out of this question emerged a new concept that would shape the dairy industry for decades to come: certified milk. Certified milk was born not out of government regulation, but out of collaboration between doctors and dairymen who believed the solution was to prove, scientifically and publicly, that milk could be produced under the cleanest possible conditions. The idea was simple but radical: create a system in which milk from certain farms would be monitored, inspected, and tested regularly. If it met the highest sanitary standards, it would be stamped with a certificate of safety. Consumers, in turn, could buy this milk with confidence, knowing it had been guaranteed by experts. It was, in effect, the birth of branded trust. The first certified milk programs appeared in the United States in the 1890s, championed by pediatricians who were horrified at the rates of infant mortality in cities like New York and Chicago. They formed milk commissions that inspected farms, checked the health of cows, and tested milk for bacterial counts. Only farms that met strict requirements, clean stables, healthy animals, sterilized equipment, could sell milk labeled as certified. This milk was, of course, more expensive, but for middle and upper class families, it quickly became a badge of responsibility, a way to show they were protecting their children with the best science had to offer. The symbolism of certified milk was powerful. For the first time, trust was not based on the word of a vendor or the appearance of the liquid, but on institutional oversight. Doctors signed their names to certificates, lending their credibility and authority. Families bought bottles stamped with seals, not because they could see the difference inside, but because they believed in the process behind it. In a way, certified milk was as much about psychology as biology. It replaced fear with confidence, anxiety with assurance. And in a society exhausted by decades of betrayal, that assurance was invaluable. But certified milk also carried contradictions. It was produced on special farms, often outside cities, with resources far beyond the reach of ordinary dairymen. The cows were well fed, their stalls cleaned daily, their handlers trained to wash hands and sterilize buckets. The milk was bottled in glass, sealed, and delivered quickly. All of this came at a cost. Certified milk could cost double or triple the price of ordinary milk, placing it firmly out of reach for poor families. In effect, the very children who needed safe milk most were excluded from the benefits. The paradox was cruel. Science had created a solution, but economics had built a wall around it. Reformers acknowledged this inequality, but argued that certified milk had a broader purpose. It set the standard. By proving that safe milk could be produced consistently, it shamed other dairies into improving practices. Certified milk became the gold standard, the ideal against which all other milk was measured. Public health advocates used it as a weapon in debates, pointing to farms that produced spotless milk as proof that disease and contamination were preventable, not inevitable. If one farm could do it, why not all? There's a curious irony in how certified milk was marketed. Advertisements emphasized not only safety, but also prestige. To buy certified milk was to signal that you were educated, modern, and conscientious. It was no longer just about feeding children. It was about identity and class. A glass bottle with a certified seal on the breakfast table became a subtle symbol of status, a quiet way to say, we care, and we can afford to care. For poor families looking in from the outside, this turned milk from a necessity into an emblem of inequality. Yet, despite its elitism, certified milk programs laid the groundwork for sweeping change. The very act of certification demonstrated that food safety could be measured, standardized, and guaranteed. It was a blueprint for future regulation, showing governments what was possible when oversight was strict and consistent. In this sense, certified milk was not just a product. It was a proof of concept, an experiment in trust that paved the way for broader laws mandating cleanliness across the industry. One striking example comes from Nathan Strauss, the philanthropist who had already established milk depots in New York. Strauss championed both pasteurization and certification, funding model dairies that produced milk under ideal conditions. He believed that once the public saw the benefits, demand would force change across the industry. And to some extent, he was right. Within a few decades, certification schemes expanded, and many dairies sought the stamp of approval not just to save lives, but to stay competitive in an evolving marketplace. Still, the paradox of certified milk remained unresolved. It was a triumph of science, but also a reminder of inequality. The very existence of a special, safer category of milk implied that ordinary milk was still unsafe. Certification divided the market into two worlds, one of safety and privilege, the other of risk and poverty. Reformers celebrated the progress, but also recognized that true justice required more than seals and certificates. It required universal change. And that realization led to the next phase of the milk story. If certified milk proved that safety was possible, the challenge was how to bring those standards to everyone, not just the wealthy. The dream of universal milk safety demanded more than commissions and seals. It demanded a fundamental restructuring of the dairy industry itself. And that fight between exclusivity and universality would define the next great battle in the history of milk. By the early 20th century, the science seemed clear. Cities that embraced pasteurization saw steep declines in infant mortality, dramatic drops in outbreaks of typhoid and tuberculosis, and healthier populations overall. Hospitals and orphanages reported that children thrived when given pasteurized milk compared to raw. Reformers used charts, statistics, and heartbreaking stories to hammer home their message. Heat saved lives. And yet, despite all this evidence, a fierce and enduring resistance rose up. Advocates of raw milk refused to yield, framing pasteurization not as salvation, but as betrayal. The result was one of the most bitter debates in the history of food safety. Raw milk advocates came from many backgrounds. Some were farmers who feared that pasteurization would mask poor hygiene on larger industrial dairies, putting small producers at a disadvantage. Others were physicians who clung to older beliefs about natural vitality, arguing that heating destroyed milk's essential life-giving properties. And many were ordinary families who distrusted government intervention, believing that meddling with nature would only make things worse. To them, raw milk was not just food, it was tradition, purity, and independence. Pasteurization, by contrast, felt like an industrial intrusion, a symbol of faceless systems replacing personal trust. And one of the most common arguments was that pasteurization killed milk. Reformers emphasized how heat destroyed harmful bacteria, but critics pointed out that it also altered taste and texture. Some claimed it weakened milk's nutritional value, robbing it of enzymes and living qualities. Farmers promoted slogans like, "Nature's milk is best," and warned mothers not to trust milk that had been tampered with by fire. While advertisements even painted pasteurization as dangerous, suggesting that boiled milk was dead food, incapable of nourishing strong children. In these arguments, science and sentiment collided head-on. The raw milk movement also played on class and emotion. Advocates framed pasteurization as a tool of big dairies and government officials who wanted to crush small farmers and dictate how families lived. They argued that wealthy elites, who had access to cleaner farms and herds, could still enjoy raw milk, while the poor were forced to accept boiled, lifeless substitutes. This narrative resonated deeply in communities that already felt marginalized by industrialization and regulation. Raw milk became a symbol of resistance, a way to assert autonomy against distant authorities. Reformers countered with data and tragedy. They pointed to outbreaks where entire neighborhoods fell ill from raw milk, to children buried because their mothers trusted natural milk, to hospitals where switching to pasteurized milk cut deaths in half. They accused raw milk advocates of clinging to illusions at the expense of children's lives. Public health campaigns grew increasingly dramatic, with posters showing skulls floating in glasses of raw milk and slogans like, "You can't see death in the bottle." The war of words became a war of images, fought in newspapers, pamphlets, and public lectures. The clash wasn't only cultural, it was legal. Cities and states began passing laws mandating pasteurization, sparking lawsuits and protests. In Chicago, New York, and Boston, milk ordinances were challenged in court by farmers and vendors who argued that the government had no right to dictate how milk was prepared. Some courts sided with reformers, affirming the state's duty to protect public health. Others hesitated, wary of setting precedents that expanded government power too far. The debate spilled into legislatures, courtrooms, and even church pulpits, where pastors framed the issue as one of morality versus freedom. The irony is that both sides had elements of truth. Pasteurization did not address the root causes of contamination: diseased cows, filthy barns, corrupt vendors. It was, in some sense, a technological band-aid, masking deeper problems in the dairy industry. Critics were right to worry that pasteurization could encourage neglect at the source. But reformers were equally right that pasteurization saved lives, even if the system producing milk remained imperfect. The debate revealed a deeper tension. Should society fix the immediate danger with technology or force structural change at the roots? What makes this clash so fascinating is how it still echoes today. More than a century later, raw milk remains controversial. Advocates argue for its taste, its supposed health benefits, and its connection to tradition. Opponents warn of the very same dangers reformers highlighted in 1910, bacteria invisible to the eye but merciless in effect. The survival of this debate shows how milk is not just about nutrition, but about trust, identity, and the eternal struggle between nature and science. There's almost a tragic comedy in how both sides used fear. Reformers terrified parents with images of death in milk. Raw advocates terrified them with images of government overreach and lifeless, sterile food. Families were caught in the middle, torn between two visions of care. And in kitchens across the world, mothers still face the same daily choice: trust the bottle or trust the boil. Ultimately, pasteurization won the legal and cultural battle in most countries. By the mid-20th century, mandatory pasteurization laws had become the norm, and raw milk was increasingly restricted or banned. Infant mortality dropped, epidemics shrank, and milk regained much of its reputation as a safe, essential food. But the scars of the debate lingered. Trust in food systems remained fragile, and every scandal, whether about milk, meat, or medicine, revived the old fear. Is science truly protecting us, or is it hiding something we cannot see? And that lingering doubt carried reformers to the next stage of the story. If trust could not be secured by pasteurization alone, if public faith remained shaken even after the laws, then something more was needed. Families wanted more than promises. They wanted proof. And so the fight turned toward laboratories, testing, and the idea that every batch of milk should not only be pasteurized, but scientifically verified, ushering in the era of systematic milk testing and quality control. Imagine the scene in an early 20th century public health laboratory. A white-coated technician carefully pipettes a few drops of milk onto a glass slide, adjusts the microscope, and leans in. What the naked eye cannot see, the lens reveals: writhing bacteria, countless tiny shapes crowding every corner of the sample. Some are harmless, but others are killers. Typhoid, tuberculosis, diphtheria, lurking invisibly in what families pour into their children's cups. For decades, milk had been judged by its whiteness, its taste, or its smell. Now, for the first time, it could be judged scientifically. The microscope turned milk into data, and that data would change everything. Laboratory testing was the next logical step after pasteurization. Reformers had won battles in city councils and legislatures, but skepticism lingered. Critics asked, how do we know pasteurization actually worked? How do we know the dairies are honest? Trust needed more than promises. It needed proof. Testing gave reformers the ammunition they had long sought. By measuring bacterial counts, fat content, and signs of adulteration, laboratories could expose fraud and contamination with cold precision. No longer could vendors wave away accusations by saying, the milk looks fine. Science could now put milk on trial. One of the most common tests introduced was the bacteriological count. Inspectors collected samples from dairies and markets, plated them in nutrient gels, and counted colonies of bacteria. Safe milk had to stay under a set limit. Anything above was deemed dangerous. Another test measured butterfat levels, ensuring vendors had not watered down milk or skimmed off cream to cheat customers. Chemical tests detected starch, chalk, or formaldehyde, additives that had been impossible to prove before. Suddenly, every dishonest practice could be revealed with a dropper, a flame, and a microscope. The impact on public health was enormous. Cities that implemented routine testing saw dramatic improvements. Vendors who once freely adulterated milk now faced the risk of exposure, fines, or closure. Consumers, too, gained new confidence. When bottles bore labels stating tested and approved, families felt reassured that safety was no longer left to chance. It was not just about laws anymore, it was about verification. Milk was being transformed from a gamble into a measurable commodity. But laboratory testing also reshaped the relationship between producers and the public. Farmers complained bitterly about inspectors dipping into their cans, fearing unfair accusations or bureaucratic overreach. Some accused laboratories of bias, claiming city officials targeted small dairies while turning a blind eye to larger corporations. Lawsuits flew as vendors challenged bacterial counts in court, arguing that milk naturally contained microbes and that setting arbitrary limits was unjust. In truth, they were not entirely wrong. Early testing methods were inconsistent, and results could vary depending on how samples were collected or stored. Science was powerful, but it was not yet perfect. Still, even with flaws, laboratory testing introduced a new idea that was revolutionary. Food safety could be standardized. For the first time, milk was not just subject to moral appeals or symbolic seals, it was subject to numbers. A bottle was either above or below the limit, either safe or unsafe. This shift from subjective trust to objective measurement marked the dawn of modern quality control. And once society accepted it for milk, the model spread to meat, water, and eventually every packaged product on the market. One fascinating consequence was how testing changed consumer culture. Housewives began asking not only for milk, but for certified tested milk. Newspapers published bacterial counts alongside market prices. In some cities, health departments posted weekly milk scorecards, ranking dairies by cleanliness. Families debated which brands had the lowest counts, just as today we might compare nutrition labels. The microscope had created a new kind of marketing. Scientific credibility became as important as taste or price. But this transformation was not without its ironies. Testing made milk safer overall, yet it also widened inequalities. Wealthier families could afford brands that proudly advertised low bacterial counts, while poorer families continued buying cheap milk from vendors less likely to be inspected. In some cases, the very act of testing raised prices, as dairies passed inspection costs onto consumers. Once again, the paradox of milk appeared. Progress saved lives, but not equally. The weakest and poorest often remained most exposed. The cultural symbolism of testing cannot be overstated. For centuries, mothers had sniffed, sipped, and hoped. Now they could point to numbers, stamps, and certificates. Milk became not only nourishment, but evidence of modernity. A family with tested milk on the table was not just feeding their children. They were participating in the march of progress, embracing science as a partner in survival. This faith in science reshaped daily life, planting seeds of trust that would later extend to everything from canned goods to vaccines. Yet the introduction of laboratory testing also revealed its own limits. Even with bacterial counts and chemical analysis, milk could still harbor unseen dangers if herds were diseased, equipment neglected, or laws unenforced. Science could measure contamination, but it could not eliminate the corruption of human systems. Reformers quickly realized that testing alone was not enough. To truly secure milk, the entire chain from cow to consumer had to be standardized and monitored. And so, as laboratories grew busier and science grew sharper, reformers set their sights on an even more ambitious dream, not just testing milk after the fact, but building a system where every step of its production was guaranteed to be safe. This vision would give birth to the idea of the modern dairy industry, regulated, industrialized, and designed to provide milk that was not merely tested for safety, but produced under conditions where safety was built in from the very start. By the early decades of the 20th century, the dairy trade no longer resembled the small-scale, intimate system of neighborhood vendors ladling milk from tin pails. Milk had become a national industry, reshaped by science, technology, and law. Refrigeration, pasteurization, bottling, and laboratory testing had laid the groundwork for trust, but these measures also required scale. Small dairymen simply could not keep up with the demands of modern hygiene, and so milk became one of the first foods to be industrialized in a way that mirrored steel, textiles, and railroads. What had once been local and personal was now large, standardized, and mechanized. Industrialization began with consolidation. Hundreds of small dairies, unable to afford the costs of pasteurizers, bottling plants, or laboratory testing, were bought out or pushed aside by larger companies. These companies invested in modern plants where milk could be processed on a massive scale, run through pasteurizers, bottled automatically, and stored in refrigerated warehouses. What had once been a chaotic, fragmented market slowly became dominated by fewer, bigger players. The face of the milkman delivering to doorsteps was still familiar, but behind him stood not a small stable, but a vast corporate system. The shift was dramatic for farmers as well. Instead of selling milk directly to local families or vendors, farmers now sold to processing plants. These plants set strict standards. Cows had to be tested for tuberculosis, barns inspected, milk cooled quickly after milking. Farmers who failed to comply were dropped. The balance of power shifted. Farmers were no longer independent suppliers, but cogs in a larger machine, subject to contracts and regulations dictated by companies and governments. Industrialization, in this sense, was both a safeguard and a chain, protecting consumers, but binding producers. Technology fueled this transformation. Pasteurization machines capable of treating thousands of gallons per hour replaced small kettles. Conveyor belts carried bottles through washing, filling, and sealing stations in gleaming rows of steel and glass. Refrigerated trucks replaced horse-drawn wagons, extending delivery routes far beyond the limits of city boundaries. Milk depots gave way to centralized plants where every drop could be monitored, standardized, and branded. It was efficiency on an industrial scale, and it fundamentally altered the rhythm of supply and demand. The cultural symbolism of this change was immense. For centuries, milk had carried an aura of simplicity, even innocence. It was the food of childhood, the emblem of nature's purity. Industrialization stripped away much of that imagery, replacing the cow in the meadow with the factory whistle and the stainless steel vat. Advertisers worked hard to repair the image, showing cows grazing in sunlit fields, even as most milk now traveled through mechanical pipelines. This duality, nostalgia for nature alongside dependence on industry, defined milk's new identity. Families wanted to believe in the meadow, but they trusted the machine. And trust was key because industrialization also introduced distance. Consumers no longer knew the farmers who produced their milk. They no longer saw the barns, smelled the hay, or watched the cows being milked. Instead, they saw company logos stamped on bottles and trucks. The personal trust of old between a mother and her local vendor was replaced by institutional trust, mediated by science, regulation, and branding. It was safer, yes, but also colder, less intimate. Milk had become not just a drink, but a product. And with that transformation came both relief and unease. One of the more curious side effects of industrialization was the invention of new milk products. Skim milk, once considered waste after cream was skimmed off, was now bottled and sold. Condensed and evaporated milk were produced in factories, extending shelf life and opening global markets. Powdered milk, developed for soldiers and explorers, entered households as a cheaper alternative to fresh milk. Industrialization did not just make milk safer, it made it versatile, turning it into a family of products tailored to every budget and circumstance. What had once been singular became multiple, and consumers had to navigate a new world of choices. Yet, industrialization carried costs. Small farmers lost independence, urban dairymen lost livelihoods, and consumers lost intimacy. The very efficiency that made milk safer also made it less personal. Families had to place their faith in distant systems they could not see, in inspectors they'd never met, in machines they did not understand. And whenever scandals erupted, when a batch of contaminated milk slipped through, when a plant was caught cutting corners, the betrayal felt all the sharper. The larger the system, the greater the shock when it failed. Still, industrialization was inevitable. The scale of urban populations, the demands of modern hygiene, and the march of technology all pointed in one direction. Milk was no longer a local commodity, it was a national necessity. Its survival depended on systems capable of feeding millions, and only industry could provide that scale. In this way, milk became a blueprint for modern food production, showing how tradition could be mechanized without entirely losing its cultural weight. But even as milk was industrialized, new questions arose. If the industry could guarantee safety and scale, could it also guarantee fairness? Would industrial dairies serve poor neighborhoods with the same quality as wealthy ones? Would farmers crushed by contracts be treated justly? And would consumers continue to trust companies as much as they once trusted the neighbor's cow in the backyard? These questions revealed that industrialization, while powerful, was not a final solution. It was another step in a journey where safety, trust, and justice were constantly negotiated. And so, the stage was set for the next transformation. If milk could be mechanized, bottled, and branded, why not extend its reach even further? Why not use industrialization not just to feed cities, but to connect entire nations, exporting milk and its byproducts across oceans? The story of milk was no longer local or even national. It was becoming global. And with that global reach came both opportunity and a new layer of risk as milk moved from the family kitchen into the great machinery of international trade. By the mid-20th century, milk had already traveled an astonishing journey. From the dangerous, bacteria-laden buckets of 19th century slums, it had become a product of industrial systems, with pasteurizers, laboratories, and refrigeration chains. But the next stage of its story would stretch far beyond the boundaries of cities or even nations. Milk, once a fragile and local commodity, began to cross oceans. Its byproducts, powdered milk, condensed milk, evaporated milk, butter, and cheese, turned it into a global force. The white liquid that had once soured within hours now became part of international trade, war strategy, and even cultural identity. The breakthrough came through preservation. Condensed and evaporated milk, developed in the 19th century, became staples during wars and famines. They were portable, durable, and required no refrigeration, making them ideal for soldiers, explorers, and remote communities. Nestlé, one of the first companies to mass-produce condensed milk, expanded rapidly, shipping cans around the world. By the early 20th century, Nestlé products could be found in South America, Asia, and Africa, introducing milk to societies where fresh dairy had never been a central part of the diet. Milk was no longer bound to the cow, it was now bound to industry, tin, and trade. Powdered milk pushed globalization even further. Dehydrated into light, long-lasting form, it could be shipped in bulk to colonies, refugee camps, or famine-stricken regions. Governments embraced it as a tool of empire and aid. During World War II, millions of tons of powdered milk were produced and distributed to soldiers and civilians alike. After the war, powdered milk became a staple in international aid programs. Organizations like UNICEF and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration distributed it to malnourished children worldwide, often branding it as the symbol of modern nutrition. A scoop of powder dissolved in water became both survival and propaganda, proof that science and industry could feed the world. But globalization also reshaped diets and cultures in unexpected ways. In places where dairy had never been central, such as East Asia, parts of Africa, and the Pacific Islands, powdered milk and condensed milk introduced entirely new habits. Sweetened condensed milk became a foundation of desserts in Vietnam, coffee culture in Thailand, and baking traditions in Latin America. Powdered milk found its way into school feeding programs in India and Africa, reshaping generations of taste and nutrition. Milk, once culturally specific, was becoming universal, a global symbol of nourishment, modernity, and Western influence. This expansion, however, carried contradictions. For many societies, milk was biologically difficult to digest. Lactose intolerance was and remains common in much of the world, particularly in Asia and Africa. Yet the spread of milk products was often framed as the spread of progress. Western companies marketed milk as the key to health and strength, sometimes ignoring or dismissing local food traditions. Advertisements in colonial contexts showed robust white children drinking milk, implying that adopting dairy was part of adopting modern civilization. Milk was not just nutrition, it was ideology, a subtle instrument of cultural dominance. The economics of globalization also created imbalances. Wealthy nations with surplus milk supplies, particularly in Europe and North America, found markets for their excess by exporting powdered milk abroad. Developing nations became dependent on these imports, often undermining local agricultural traditions. In some regions, farmers producing traditional grains or legumes could not compete with the flood of cheap powdered milk sold under the banner of aid. What began as charity sometimes became economic control, binding local diets to the fortunes of global dairy giants. There's a striking irony in how milk, once feared as dangerous, became a tool of soft power. In the 19th century, milk killed children in city slums. In the 20th, it was marketed as the savior of starving children in distant lands. Governments proudly used milk distribution as evidence of progress. In the United States, the famous Got Milk campaigns of the late 20th century were only the latest chapter in a long tradition of linking milk to national strength. In Europe, school children received free milk as part of programs meant not only to nourish, but to instill loyalty to the state. In colonies and developing nations, milk distribution was presented as a gift from industrialized powers, reinforcing global hierarchies even as it saved lives. Yet the globalization of milk also sparked creativity. Local cultures adapted these new products in unique ways. In Brazil, sweetened condensed milk became the heart of brigadeiros, beloved chocolate confections. In the Philippines, powdered milk found its way into breads and pastries. In India, government programs encouraged children to drink reconstituted milk in school canteens, weaving it into the national diet. Milk became global not only because it was exported, but because it was transformed, reshaped by the hands of local cooks and families into foods that blended foreign technology with native traditions. And yet, the story was not purely celebratory. As milk became global, so too did its controversies. Scandals erupted when contaminated or spoiled powdered milk was shipped abroad, leading to illness and death. Critics accused corporations of using aid programs to build dependency, hooking nations on milk products they could not produce themselves. And scientists began to question whether milk was truly the universal food it was marketed to be, pointing to lactose intolerance and alternative sources of nutrition. Milk's global spread, once hailed as triumph, began to look like both a blessing and a burden. The globalization of milk marked a turning point. What had once been local and fragile became industrial and international. It saved lives, reshaped diets, and became a tool of power and identity. But with that expansion came new challenges: cultural clashes, economic imbalances, and biological contradictions. Milk was no longer just a drink, it was a symbol of globalization itself, carrying with it both hope and controversy. And this, in turn, led reformers and critics alike to a new question. If milk could reshape the world, who should control it? Governments, corporations, or local communities? The next stage of the story would confront this tension head-on, as milk moved from being simply traded across borders to being weaponized in politics, propaganda, and even international conflict. By the mid-20th century, milk had completed its journey from fragile, local liquid to global commodity. But beyond nutrition, beyond commerce, milk took on a new and unexpected role. It became a weapon in politics, a tool in propaganda campaigns, and a symbol governments used to project power, progress, and even ideology. The same liquid once feared as deadly in city slums now became the banner of health, national strength, and moral superiority. Milk was no longer just something to drink, it was something to believe in. Governments quickly discovered that milk's symbolism was powerful. It was white, pure, associated with children and motherhood. To promote milk was to promote innocence, vitality, and trust. In the United States, during the Great Depression, the federal government launched milk distribution programs in schools. Glasses of milk handed out at lunchtime were not only about nutrition, they were about demonstrating that the state could protect children in a time of crisis. Photographs of smiling students drinking milk circulated widely, turning dairy into a political emblem of government care. During World War II, milk became a weapon of morale. In Britain, despite rationing, the government ensured milk remained available to children and mothers, presenting it as a patriotic duty to drink it. Posters declared, "Milk means health," and linked the daily glass of milk to national resilience against Nazi Germany. In the United States, milk was tied to military strength. Propaganda showed strong soldiers drinking milk, suggesting that dairy built the bodies that would win the war. Farmers were praised as part of the arsenal of democracy, their cows cast as silent soldiers in the fight. But the use of milk in politics extended beyond wartime. In the Cold War era, milk became a symbolic battlefield between East and West. In the Soviet Union, dairy products were promoted as proof of socialism's ability to provide for its people. State-run dairies were showcased in propaganda films with workers in white coats filling bottles in spotless factories, accompanied by slogans about collective strength. Meanwhile, in the United States, milk was woven into campaigns about abundance and freedom, a product of private enterprise and consumer choice. A glass of milk at the American breakfast table became, in its own way, a declaration of capitalism's superiority. This ideological duel even spilled into international aid. Both the US and the USSR distributed milk powder and condensed milk to developing nations as part of their influence campaigns. For Washington, milk shipments to Latin America and Asia symbolized generosity and modernity. For Moscow, milk distribution in Eastern Europe and Africa symbolized the benefits of socialism. A cup of reconstituted milk, ladled out in a village school, became a quiet form of propaganda, its taste infused with ideology. The child who drank it was not just nourished, he was enrolled in a vision of the future. Advertising mirrored these political currents. In the West, campaigns tied milk to individual success: strong bones, tall children, productive workers. The "Got Milk" campaign of the 1990s, though lighthearted, carried the same DNA, portraying milk as essential to thriving in modern society. In the East, milk was less about individual achievement and more about collective pride. Posters in the Soviet Union showed happy families raising glasses together, slogans linking milk to the progress of the state. Both sides understood milk's emotional resonance. To sell milk was to sell trust, and to sell trust was to sell ideology. There's a curious irony here. For centuries, milk had been mistrusted, linked to disease, death, and fraud. By the mid-20th century, the same product was exalted as proof of national virtue. The transformation reveals less about the liquid itself and more about how societies project meaning onto food. Milk was not inherently democratic or socialist, capitalist, or collectivist. It was a blank canvas onto which governments painted their visions of identity. The glass on the breakfast table was no longer just breakfast. It was politics poured daily, consumed without question. And yet, propaganda was not always benign. Milk was also used to manipulate. In the United States, aggressive advertising campaigns pushed milk consumption far beyond nutritional necessity, sometimes ignoring scientific debates about lactose intolerance or alternative diets. In developing nations, milk aid programs often created dependency on imports, undermining local food systems, while dressing the effort in the language of generosity. Governments used milk not only to nourish, but to control, sometimes blurring the line between care and coercion. One striking example is the U.S. school milk program during the 20th century. While it undoubtedly improved child nutrition, it was also deeply tied to the politics of farm subsidies. Surplus milk from American farmers was funneled into schools, not only to feed children, but to stabilize dairy markets. Thus, a child's daily carton was at once health policy, economic policy, and political propaganda. What looked like simple kindness was, in reality, a carefully engineered system of agricultural economics dressed up in white cartons and smiling mascots. The legacy of milk as propaganda lingers even today. National school milk programs continue in many countries, often defended as essential to child health. Milk advertisements still tap into themes of purity, strength, and family. And in global trade disputes, dairy remains one of the most politically sensitive sectors, protected by tariffs and subsidies precisely because it carries symbolic as well as nutritional weight. Milk, once feared, now stands as one of the most politicized foods on Earth. But with politicization comes scrutiny. As science advanced and nutrition debates grew louder, critics began to question whether the political glorification of milk had outpaced its actual health benefits. Was milk truly the universal drink it was marketed to be, or was it a convenient vehicle for governments and corporations to push their agendas? That question opened the door to a new stage in milk's story, one in which scientific evidence, public health policy, and cultural perception would collide in a debate that continues to this day. For most of the 20th century, milk was treated almost like a sacred substance. Governments, advertisers, and schools insisted that it was indispensable for strong bones, tall stature, and robust health. Posters showed smiling children holding glasses of milk with slogans like, "Nature's perfect food." Doctors recommended it to patients of all ages, and nutrition guides placed it at the center of balanced diets. To question milk was to question progress itself. Yet as science advanced and societies grew more skeptical of traditional food dogmas, milk's untouchable status began to crack. What had once been celebrated as a miracle drink was increasingly scrutinized, debated, and sometimes even rejected. The cornerstone of milk's reputation was calcium. Generations were taught that without daily glasses of milk, bones would crumble, teeth would rot, and children would fail to grow tall and strong. Campaigns hammered home this message so relentlessly that it became cultural instinct. Milk equals bones. And indeed, milk is rich in calcium and protein. But scientific studies in the late 20th century began to complicate the story. Some showed that populations with high dairy consumption did not necessarily have lower rates of osteoporosis or fractures compared to populations that consumed little or no milk. In fact, in parts of Asia and Africa where dairy was not central, rates of bone disease were sometimes lower than in milk-drinking Western nations. The paradox shook confidence in milk's supposed inevitability. Lactose intolerance added another layer to the debate. Scientists pointed out that the ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, was not universal, but a genetic adaptation found mainly in populations of European descent. In much of East Asia, Africa, and indigenous communities in the Americas, the majority of adults were lactose intolerant, experiencing bloating, cramps, and diarrhea when drinking milk. For centuries, this had been considered a personal inconvenience, but in the age of global milk marketing, it became a political and nutritional question. Was milk really nature's perfect food if billions of people could not digest it? Or was its global promotion an example of cultural imperialism, forcing Western dietary norms onto populations with different needs? There's a bitter irony here. In the 1950s and 60s, international aid programs often distributed powdered milk to famine-stricken regions in Asia and Africa. While it saved lives in emergencies, it also created long-term dependency and discomfort for populations biologically ill-suited to dairy. Children sometimes suffered digestive distress from the very aid meant to nourish them. Critics argued that such programs reflected more about the surplus economics of Western dairy industries than the genuine nutritional needs of recipients. Milk, once seen as salvation, became entangled in debates about exploitation, cultural arrogance, and misguided science. Meanwhile, health science itself was shifting. By the 1970s and 80s, concerns emerged about milk's fat content. Whole milk, long celebrated as wholesome, came under fire for its saturated fat and cholesterol. Nutritionists linked high dairy intake to heart disease and obesity. Governments scrambled to adjust food guidelines, now recommending skim or low-fat milk instead of whole. Advertising pivoted quickly. Suddenly, milk was not just about strength, but about slimness and modern health. This shift created confusion. Was milk a foundation of vitality or a hidden culprit in chronic disease? The answer seemed to depend on which decade you asked. Protein became the next battlefield. Supporters of milk emphasized its high-quality protein, essential for growth and repair. Critics countered that most Western diets already contained more protein than necessary, and that milk was not unique in this regard. Plant-based alternatives, soy, almonds, oats, began to challenge dairy's monopoly, offering protein without lactose or saturated fat. For many consumers, the rise of these alternatives turned milk from a necessity into a choice, opening the door to lifestyle diets like veganism that outright rejected dairy. The cultural backlash was striking. In the 1990s, campaigns like Got Milk tried to reassert milk's dominance with clever, celebrity-driven ads. But even as actors and athletes posed with milk mustaches, scientific debates rumbled in the background. Was milk truly essential, or was its reputation the product of decades of propaganda and subsidies? Documentaries, books, and activist groups began framing milk not as a universal good, but as a contested, sometimes unnecessary food. In this narrative, milk was not the hero of health, but the survivor of clever marketing. One of the most fascinating aspects of this debate is how it reveals the intersection of biology and culture. For centuries, dairy was essential in societies that developed lactose tolerance, becoming part of identity and cuisine. Think of Swiss cheese, French cream, or Irish butter. But in societies without that adaptation, milk never held the same place. The globalization of milk created a clash, a biological reality colliding with cultural marketing. What was natural for some was unnatural for others, yet both were told the same universal story. That tension continues to echo in nutritional debates today. Even modern science remains divided. Some studies suggest moderate dairy consumption supports bone health and may reduce risks of certain conditions. Others highlight links to acne, digestive issues, or even higher cancer risk with excessive intake. The truth, as always, is complex. Milk is neither poison nor miracle. It is a food, valuable for some, problematic for others, unnecessary for many. But because of its history as the perfect food, every nuance becomes magnified into controversy. And this controversy did more than spark dietary debates. It inspired alternatives. Soy milk, almond milk, oat milk, and countless others exploded in popularity in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. They marketed themselves not just as substitutes, but as statements, choices against industrial dairy, against lactose intolerance, against old nutritional dogmas. The rise of plant-based milks was not simply about taste, it was about identity, health, and ethics, and their growth suggested that milk's long reign as unquestioned king of the diet was finally under challenge. But that challenge carried its own questions. Were plant-based milks truly healthier? Were they sustainable? Or were they repeating milk's old story, packaging ideology as nutrition? These debates marked the next stage in milk's story, where the battle was no longer between contaminated versus safe milk, but between dairy and its new rivals in the global marketplace of trust. If you walked into a supermarket in 1950 and asked for almond milk, you would have been met with blank stares. The dairy aisle was the kingdom of the cow, lined with bottles, cartons, and tubs of butter, cream, and cheese. Milk was considered so essential, so unquestionable, that alternatives were almost unthinkable. Fast forward to today, and the scene is utterly transformed. Almond, soy, oat, rice, coconut, cashew. Entire aisles are now devoted to liquids that dare to call themselves milk. What was once fringe has become mainstream, not just a curiosity for the lactose intolerant, but a cultural phenomenon reshaping global diets. The story of plant-based milks is not only about nutrition, it is about rebellion, identity, and the enduring human habit of questioning what once seemed sacred. The earliest modern wave came with soy. In the mid-20th century, soy milk was largely confined to East Asian cuisines, where it had been consumed for centuries in places like China and Japan. In the West, it entered quietly, marketed primarily as a health food in natural shops for those who could not digest cow's milk. For decades, it remained a niche associated with vegetarians, immigrants, and the countercultural fringes. But as debates about dairy's health risks grew louder in the 1970s and 80s, soy milk gained traction. It was high in protein, low in saturated fat, and most importantly, it allowed people to say, "I don't need cow's milk to live well." The real explosion, however, came in the late 20th and early 21st centuries with the rise of almond and oat milk. Almond milk captured the imagination first, presenting itself as both luxurious and health-conscious. Advertisements emphasized its lightness, its elegance, its ancient roots in Mediterranean cuisine. Almond milk was not just an alternative, it was aspirational, a drink for those who wanted to signal sophistication as much as health. Then oat milk burst onto the scene, marketed as creamy, sustainable, and perfectly suited to coffee culture. Baristas embraced it, cafes advertised it, and suddenly oat milk was everywhere, hailed as the milk for the modern urbanite. Behind this rise was more than just taste. Plant-based milks became cultural statements, To choose soy, almond, or oat milk was to choose against something, against industrial farming, against animal cruelty, against lactose intolerance, against climate change. Every carton carried not just nutrition facts, but ideology. Companies leaned into this, plastering slogans like "Ditch Dairy" or "The future is plant-based" across their marketing. Drinking plant-based milk became a way to perform values, to align oneself with environmentalism, ethical consumption, or personal wellness. The environmental argument was particularly powerful. Dairy farming consumes enormous amounts of land and water, while also producing methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Campaigns highlighted that a liter of almond or oat milk required a fraction of the resources of a liter of cow's milk. Documentaries and reports framed dairy as a climate culprit, positioning plant-based alternatives as part of the solution. For a generation growing increasingly anxious about climate change, these claims resonated deeply. Choosing oat milk for a latte felt like a small but tangible act of resistance against a warming planet. And yet, the story was not without complications. Almond milk, for example, requires vast amounts of water to grow, especially in drought-prone California, where much of the world's supply is produced. Soy cultivation, while efficient, has been linked to deforestation in South America. Even oat milk, hailed as sustainable, requires industrial processing and transportation. Critics accused plant-based companies of repeating dairy's old trick, packaging ideology as purity while hiding messy realities. The irony was clear. Milk had once been marketed as nature's perfect food until scandals revealed otherwise. Now plant-based milks risked telling the same too-perfect story. The cultural clash between dairy and plant-based advocates became fierce. Dairy farmers fought back with campaigns insisting that only cow's milk deserved the name milk. Court cases in the US and Europe debated whether almond or oat beverages could legally be called milk at all. In some countries, regulations now require labels like almond drink instead of almond milk. But language itself became part of the battle. For consumers, the word milk had already shifted. It no longer meant only the liquid from a cow, but any creamy, white drink poured into cereal or coffee. The debate revealed not just a food fight, but a linguistic revolution. Taste, too, played its part. Early soy milks were often described as chalky or beany, limiting their appeal. But as technology advanced, plant-based companies mastered flavor and texture. Today's oat milk steams and froths like dairy and lattes. Almond milk blends seamlessly into smoothies, and soy milk boasts protein levels rivaling cow's milk. Innovation blurred the line further, erasing the old sensory barriers that once made alternatives second best. For many, plant-based options are not replacements, they are preferences. What makes this rise so fascinating is how it mirrors the arc of milk itself. In the 19th century, milk was both necessity and danger, symbol of purity and betrayal. In the 20th, it became propaganda, marketed as universal salvation. In the 21st, its dominance was challenged not by scarcity, but by abundance. Too many choices, too many claims, too many meanings. Plant-based milks entered not just as foods, but as narratives, each carton a small story of who we are and what we believe. And yet, the debate is far from settled. Dairy still wields enormous cultural and economic power. Billions worldwide still drink cow's milk daily, and in many regions, plant-based options remain luxuries of the urban middle class. At the same time, plant-based milks continue to grow, carving out markets, reshaping habits, and forcing dairy to defend itself with new strategies like lactose-free milk or grass-fed branding. The battlefield has shifted, but the war of trust remains, which leads to the next stage of milk's journey. If both dairy and plant-based alternatives are locked in competition for cultural, nutritional, and environmental legitimacy, what happens when technology goes one step further? What happens when milk no longer comes from cow or plant, but from the lab itself, engineered molecule by molecule to mimic dairy without animals or farms? The story of milk, it seems, is not finished. It is about to enter yet another transformation, one that might make even oat milk look traditional. Picture a stainless steel tank humming quietly in a climate-controlled facility. Inside, instead of cows chewing hay or fields of oats swaying in the wind, yeast cells are busily at work. Fed with sugar and nutrients, they churn out proteins identical to those found in cow's milk, casein and whey, without a single animal in sight. A technician in a white coat tests the liquid, adjusts the temperature, and finally pours out a glass of milk that looks, tastes, and foams like dairy but never passed through a barn. This is not science fiction. It is the frontier of lab-grown and synthetic milk. The roots of synthetic milk lie in the same anxieties that drove the rise of pasteurization, refrigeration, and plant-based alternatives: trust, health, and sustainability. For decades, critics of dairy pointed to animal cruelty, methane emissions, deforestation for feed crops, and the inefficiency of producing milk through animals. Plant-based alternatives offered part of the solution, but often fell short on taste, nutrition, or functionality. Almond milk may work in cereal, but it struggles in cheese. Oat milk may foam for coffee, but it lacks the exact proteins that give dairy its structure. The dream of scientists and entrepreneurs became clear. Could we create real milk without cows? Enter precision fermentation. Instead of milking cows, scientists program microorganisms, yeast, fungi, or bacteria, to produce dairy proteins. These proteins are then combined with plant-based fats, sugars, and vitamins to replicate milk at the molecular level. Unlike soy or almond beverages, these are not alternatives. They are chemically indistinguishable from dairy. Companies like Perfect Day in the US and Remilk in Israel are already producing casein and whey proteins this way, selling them to food manufacturers for use in ice cream, cheese, and yogurt. It's not imitation, it's reinvention. The promise of synthetic milk is staggering. No cows mean no methane, no crowded barns, no antibiotics, no risk of zoonotic disease. Production is more resource efficient, requiring less land and water. Milk can be made anywhere, independent of climate, allowing regions without strong dairy traditions to produce their own supply. For environmentalists, it represents a potential revolution, dairy without the ecological footprint. For ethicists, it's the end of the debate over animal cruelty in milk production. For consumers, it offers the taste and texture of dairy without the baggage. Yet, as history shows, innovation never comes without controversy. Just as pasteurization was once denounced as tampering with nature, synthetic milk faces skepticism. Critics argue it is unnatural, a lab product masquerading as food. Some worry about allergens or unintended health consequences of consuming engineered proteins. Others see it as another way for corporations to centralize control over food, replacing farms with patents and bioreactors. The very same anxieties that haunted early debates over milk safety, trust, transparency, and identity have resurfaced, only now with the added weight of biotechnology. There's also the irony of perception. For centuries, milk's value was tied to its image as wholesome and natural, flowing directly from the cow. Now, companies must convince consumers that milk made in steel tanks is just as trustworthy. In advertising, you can already see the balancing act. Glossy images of happy children drinking glasses of milk, alongside sleek depictions of laboratories glowing with futuristic light. Synthetic milk is sold as both nature perfected and science empowered. Whether people accept this duality remains one of the great open questions of the coming decades. The economics add another layer. Today, lab-grown milk remains expensive compared to traditional dairy, though costs are falling rapidly. Scaling production to feed millions requires not only scientific breakthroughs, but infrastructure, investment, and regulatory approval. Governments must decide how to classify these products. Are they dairy? Are they novel foods? Should they be labeled differently? Each decision carries enormous implications, not only for consumer acceptance, but for the survival of traditional farmers. The dairy industry, already bruised by plant-based competitors, sees synthetic milk as both threat and opportunity. Some fear extinction, others see a chance to rebrand and adapt. One fascinating aspect of synthetic milk is how it blurs old divides. For vegans, it raises a philosophical dilemma. If the proteins are identical to those from cows but produced without animals, is it acceptable? For the lactose intolerant, engineered milk may be modified to remove lactose entirely, solving a biological barrier that has existed for millennia. For chefs and artisans, synthetic casein and whey open the door to cheeses and yogurts with authentic textures that almond or oat milk could never mimic. It is not just replacement, it is expansion, redefining what milk can be. And just as with earlier stages of milk's history, synthetic milk is as much about psychology as chemistry. Will families trust a carton that says lab-made on the label? Will they embrace a future where food is engineered, not harvested? Or will nostalgia for the cow in the meadow prove stronger than the lure of science? These questions echo the very same fears and hopes that surrounded the arrival of pasteurization, refrigeration, and bottled milk over a century ago. History may not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. What is undeniable is that synthetic milk represents the next great chapter in humanity's relationship with this most paradoxical of foods. It has the potential to solve environmental crises, end animal suffering, and feed growing populations. But it also risks deepening divides between those who embrace science and those who cling to tradition, between wealthy consumers who can afford innovation and poorer communities left behind. Milk, once again, is not just about nutrition, it is about trust, identity, and the future we choose. And that future raises the next inevitable question. If milk can now be engineered in a lab, tailored to health, ethics, and climate, what does that mean for the very concept of food itself? Because once we accept lab-made milk, the door opens to lab-made everything. The story of milk, it seems, is not only about survival, but about redefining what it means to eat, to nourish, and to trust in a world where the line between nature and science grows ever thinner. Milk has always been more than a drink. From the moment human societies first began to consume it, it carried meanings that extended far beyond nutrition. It was associated with childhood, innocence, purity, and abundance. Advertisers, governments, and even religious groups leaned into these associations, turning milk into a canvas onto which societies projected their deepest values and anxieties. And in the modern era, milk's symbolic power has not faded. it has evolved. Today, a glass of milk on the table may seem ordinary, but beneath its whiteness lies a rich tapestry of culture, ideology, and memory. Think about childhood. For many in the West, milk is the first food remembered beyond the mother's breast. School lunches often included a carton of milk, part of government programs designed not only to nourish but to instill habits. Advertisements in the mid-20th century portrayed milk as the foundation of happy family life, with mothers pouring tall glasses for smiling children. Drinking milk became almost synonymous with being a good child, obedient and cared for. This association lingers. Even today, a child who dislikes milk is often treated as unusual, as if rejecting not just a food, but an entire cultural norm. Purity is another powerful symbol. Milk's color has always been linked to cleanliness and innocence. Poets, religious texts, and marketers alike have described it as a liquid of purity, untouched and natural. This imagery was particularly ironic in the 19th century, when milk was often anything but pure, adulterated with chalk or laced with bacteria. Yet the symbolism endured, and advertisers worked tirelessly to reconnect the image of milk with the ideals of nature and health. Even now, white as milk remains shorthand for something unspoiled and virtuous, despite the complex industrial realities behind its production. In modern culture, milk also represents strength and vitality. Sports campaigns often feature athletes drinking milk to emphasize its link with power. The Got Milk campaign in the United States became one of the most iconic marketing efforts of the late 20th century, splashing celebrities and athletes across billboards with milk mustaches. The message was simple: milk isn't just for children. It's for anyone who wants to be strong, successful, and attractive. That campaign transformed milk from a symbol of innocence into one of aspiration, rebranding it for adult audiences and embedding it in pop culture. At the same time, milk has taken on new roles in identity politics. For vegans, rejecting milk is not just a dietary choice, but a moral statement against animal exploitation. For environmentalists, boycotting dairy can symbolize resistance to industries linked with climate change and resource depletion. On the other side, dairy advocates present milk as a cultural heritage tied to farming traditions, rural life, and national identity. In some countries, drinking milk is portrayed almost as a patriotic act, supporting local farmers and resisting foreign imports. Thus, milk has become a battlefield of values, each side claiming it represents the true meaning of health, ethics, or community. Curiously, milk has also been weaponized in more literal cultural clashes. In recent years, extremist groups have used milk as a bizarre symbol of purity and dominance, twisting its imagery into something exclusionary. Online forums have mocked lactose intolerance as weakness, turning milk into a tool of identity politics in ways that would have baffled earlier generations. This strange appropriation highlights how flexible and fragile symbols can be. What was once a universal emblem of childhood innocence can be distorted into something divisive, proof of how deeply milk remains embedded in cultural imagination. Art and literature, too, have played their part. From the biblical land of milk and honey to modern films that use milk as a symbol of both comfort and menace, the white liquid has carried layers of meaning. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange famously featured Milk Plus, a drug-laced version of milk that turned innocence into violence, upending expectations. Such examples show how milk functions almost like a mirror. It reflects whatever society projects onto it, whether that be purity, strength, or corruption. Even everyday rituals carry symbolic weight. Consider the simple act of pouring milk into coffee or cereal. These moments are tied to identity, routine, and culture. In some households, cow's milk remains non-negotiable. In others, oat or almond milk signals a conscious choice about ethics or health. The choice of milk has become a shorthand for who you are. Traditionalist, environmentalist, modernist, or somewhere in between. In this sense, milk has joined the ranks of foods like bread or wine, whose cultural resonance far exceeds their physical properties. There is also the nostalgia factor. For many, milk conjures memories of childhood kitchens, school lunches, or family farms. This nostalgia is so powerful that dairy companies often lean on it in advertising, showing pastoral scenes of cows in green fields, even when most milk today comes from industrial operations. Consumers buy not just the liquid, but the story, the promise that in drinking milk they are connecting to something timeless and natural. Whether or not that promise is real, it keeps the bond between milk and memory alive. And yet, beneath the nostalgia and symbolism lies a growing unease. Modern debates about lactose intolerance, animal welfare, and climate change chip away at milk's image of purity. The once unquestioned symbol of health is now contested, with critics exposing its complexities. This tension between symbolism and reality gives milk a unique place in modern culture. It is at once cherished and doubted, celebrated and critiqued. Its very contradictions make it endlessly fascinating, a food that carries as much meaning as it does nutrition, which brings us to the final stage of milk's long journey. If milk has traveled from peril to purity, from necessity to controversy, from symbol of innocence to tool of ideology, what comes next? The last chapter of this story asks not what milk has meant in the past, but what it will mean in the future. As lab-grown dairy, plant-based alternatives, and shifting cultural values reshape our choices, milk is no longer just a liquid. It is a question. A question about trust, tradition, and the kind of world we want to build. And that question will be the heart of the final chapter. The story of milk has always been a story of survival, trust, and transformation. From the open pails of disease-ridden city streets to the polished glass bottles of the industrial era, from the pasteurizers of reformers to the sleek cartons of oat and almond blends, milk has mirrored the struggles and triumphs of human society. It has been praised as nature's perfect food, condemned as a dangerous fraud, repackaged as propaganda, and reinvented in laboratories. Yet here we are in the 21st century still asking the same essential question. What does milk mean to us, and what will it become? The future of milk will be shaped by forces larger than nutrition. Climate change, technology ethics, and shifting cultural values will decide what fills the glasses of tomorrow's children. Dairy farming, as it exists today, faces immense pressure. Cows are among the largest agricultural contributors to methane emissions, and the land and water required to sustain them are increasingly unsustainable in a warming world. Environmental reports warn that dairy, if left unchecked, could become incompatible with global climate goals. For many, this makes the traditional image of the cow in the pasture less a symbol of purity and more a symbol of crisis. At the same time, plant-based alternatives are no longer niche. They have broken into mainstream diets, especially in urban centers, and their growth shows no sign of slowing. Oat milk dominates coffee culture, almond milk lines, supermarket shelves, and soy milk continues to hold strong in global markets. Each alternative offers a different promise: sustainability, digestibility, ethics, yet none are without flaws. Almonds demand enormous water resources, soy raises deforestation concerns, and processing itself creates energy costs. The consumer of the future will face not a single choice of milk or no milk, but a complex web of trade-offs, each carton carrying its own ecological and ethical weight. Then there is the promise and controversy of lab-grown milk. Precision fermentation has already proven it can create dairy proteins without cows. In theory, this technology could produce milk with a fraction of the environmental footprint, eliminate animal suffering, and customize nutrition by enhancing vitamins or removing lactose. Imagine milk tailored not only to avoid allergies, but to improve gut health, boost immunity, or even extend shelf life without additives. Yet acceptance is far from guaranteed. As history shows, the moment food moves too far from tradition, resistance rises. Will families trust milk that comes from tanks rather than teats? Or will synthetic milk face the same skepticism that once plagued pasteurization and refrigeration, only to be embraced later when its benefits become undeniable? The cultural role of milk will also evolve. In some societies, it will remain a staple, tied to identity, heritage, and cuisine. In others, it may fade, replaced by alternatives that better align with biology and values. Already, younger generations in parts of Asia and Europe are drinking less dairy than their parents. While plant-based and hybrid products surge, marketing will adapt, as it always has. Future campaigns may no longer show cows grazing in meadows, but sleek laboratories glowing with clean energy, or lush oat fields promising sustainability. Milk will remain a symbol, but its meaning will shift again, reflecting not only purity or strength, but responsibility for the planet. One fascinating possibility lies in the merging of worlds. The future may not be dairy versus plant-based versus synthetic, but blends of all three. Imagine a product made with oat base, fortified with lab-grown dairy proteins, flavored naturally, and designed for minimal environmental impact. These hybrids could offer the taste and function of milk with the ethics and efficiency of alternatives. Such innovations would blur the lines, making the very definition of milk more fluid than ever. The battle over labels, what deserves to be called milk, may become obsolete when consumers no longer care about the source, only the story it tells. But perhaps the most important shift will be psychological. For centuries, milk has carried promises of safety, of strength, of health, of progress. Its failures have come when those promises were broken, when reality clashed with the image in the glass. The future of milk will depend less on cows or crops or cells than on whether consumers feel they can trust what they drink. Transparency, sustainability, and honesty will define success. A carton that admits its trade-offs may win more loyalty than one that pretends to be perfect. After all, milk's history is littered with betrayals born of overpromises. The future may reward humility. And so we arrive at a striking conclusion. The future of milk is not fixed. It is a liquid in more ways than one, shaped and reshaped by human hands, beliefs, and needs. It may flow from cows for generations to come, or it may increasingly be poured from oats, almonds, or stainless steel tanks. It may remain central to diets, or it may become one option among many, its dominance a relic of the past. But whatever form it takes, milk will continue to mirror us, our fears, our hopes, our contradictions, because milk has never just been about nourishment. It has been about who we are, what we value, and how we imagine the future. And as long as those questions remain unresolved, the story of milk will never end. It will keep evolving, glass by glass, generation by generation, carrying with it the weight of history and the possibility of tomorrow.